The iron hissed, a sharp puff of steam rising to meet the cool, air-conditioned draft of the laundry room. Clara held the heavy plastic handle, her palms slick with a thin sheen of sweat. Beneath the metal plate, the stiff cotton of her brother Julian's dress shirt smoothed out, the deep creases from the shipping box vanishing under the heat. The scent of hot starch and scorched water filled the narrow utility closet, a familiar, sterile aroma that had anchored Clara's Friday evenings for as long as she could remember. On the wall beside the dryer hung the master family calendar, a large, laminated grid bordered in magnet strips. Every square was crowded with life. Julian's corporate presentation was highlighted in bold blue ink. Maya's varsity track banquet was circled in bright, neon pink. Their father's business trip to Chicago was marked with heavy black slashes. Squeezed into the lower right corner of the square for Friday the 14th, written in a faint ballpoint pencil that barely registered against the glossy laminate, were the words, "Clara's graduation, 10 a.m." A sticky note about Maya's physical therapy appointment had been pasted directly over it, the yellow paper curling at the edges, obscuring the word graduation entirely. Clara adjusted the collar of Julian's shirt, her fingers working the stiff fabric. Her shoulders ached with a dull, familiar fatigue. She didn't press the yellow sticky note down. She didn't move it. She simply stared at the corner of her own name, partially visible under the adhesive strip, and felt the quiet, steady hum of the washing machine vibrate through the soles of her sneakers. The kitchen door swung open, the squeak of the hinges cutting through the low rumble of the appliances. "Clara, are you in here?" Eleanor, her mother, didn't wait for an answer. She stepped into the laundry room, her high heels clicking sharply on the linoleum. She was holding a large, white cardboard box and scrolling through her phone with her thumb, her eyes darting across the screen. She didn't look at Clara. Her focus remained locked on the blue light of the display. "The florist called about the centerpieces for Julian's promotion dinner next weekend," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the practiced, breathless cadence of someone perpetually 5 minutes behind schedule. "They don't have the white lilies. I told them orchids would be fine, but now your father is saying orchids look too corporate. Can you call them back and see if they can source the white roses? The number is on the fridge." Clara lifted the iron, setting it upright on its heel. The metallic click echoed in the small space. "The florist closed at 6, Mom." Eleanor paused her scrolling for a fraction of a second, her thumb hovering. She let out a soft, exasperated sigh, though her eyes never left the screen. "Well, first thing tomorrow then. And Julian needs this shirt boxed, not hung. He says the hangers ruin the shoulder structure when he travels." "He's leaving on Tuesday," Clara said quietly. "Exactly. So we need to have everything packed by Sunday night. You know how he gets when he's rushed." Eleanor finally dropped her phone into her purse, though her hand remained wrapped around the strap, ready to pull it back out. She looked at the pile of folded laundry on the counter, then at the shirt Clara was working on. "Did you finish Maya's track uniform? She needs the lucky socks for the semi-finals tomorrow." "They're in her drawer," Clara said. "I washed them twice to get the clay stains out." "Perfect." Eleanor reached out, taking the freshly ironed shirt from the rack. She didn't examine it, nor did she look at Clara's face. Her touch was transactional, a quick retrieval of a completed task. "Oh, and tomorrow morning, I need you to run by the dry cleaners on 4th Street. Maya's blazer for the banquet needs to be picked up before noon." "I'd go, but your father and I have to take Julian to that breakfast meeting with his new VP." Clara stood still, her hand resting on the cool plastic of the iron's handle. Tomorrow was Saturday. The university bookstore was holding the final pickup window for cap and gown distribution between 9 and 11 in the morning. If she missed it, she would have to pay a late fee, and the line on Monday morning would stretch around the block. Clara did a quick mental calculation. The dry cleaners opened at 8. If she left the house at 7:30, she could sit in the morning traffic on the bridge, wait for the cleaners to open, drive across town to the campus bookstore, wait in the student line, and make it back in time to prep lunch for the family before they returned from Julian's breakfast. It would require her to skip breakfast, drive 70 miles an hour in a 50-mile zone, and pray there were no accidents on the interstate. The alternative was asking Eleanor if someone else could pick up the blazer. But Clara knew how that conversation would go. Eleanor would look stressed, her eyebrows knitting together in that faint, defensive line. She would mention how busy Julian was, how much pressure Maya was under with finals, how Richard had been working 60-hour weeks. She would ask, with gentle, weaponized exhaustion, "Can't you just fit it in, Clara? You're always so good at managing these things." The energy required to explain her own schedule, to defend the simple necessity of picking up her graduation gown, felt like a mountain she didn't have the strength to climb. It was easier to absorb the friction herself. It was always easier to be the shock absorber. "I'll get the blazer," Clara said. "Thanks, sweetie. You're a lifesaver," Eleanor said, already turning back toward the door. Her phone buzzed in her purse, and she retrieved it with practiced speed, her thumbs immediately flying across the glass. "Don't forget the starch on Julian's other shirt, the blue one. He likes the collar stiff." The door swung shut behind her. Clara stood in the silence of the laundry room. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen next door seemed to grow louder, a low, vibrating drone that filled her ears. She looked down at the ironing board. A single drop of water had leaked from the iron's reservoir, pooling on the gray canvas cover. She watched as the fabric slowly absorbed the moisture, the dark circle expanding, turning a deeper shade of gray until it was entirely swallowed by the material. She reached out and turned the dial on the iron to off. The orange indicator light died. Clara walked out of the laundry room and into the kitchen. The house was loud. In the dining room, Maya was arguing with her father about her curfew, her voice rising in high, demanding register. Julian was on the back patio, pacing the deck while talking loudly on his headset, his laughter booming through the double-pane glass. Clara approached the refrigerator. She looked at the wall calendar. She reached out, her fingers touching the yellow sticky note that covered the date of May 14th. She peeled it back just enough to see her name. Clara's graduation. The pencil markings were thin, almost ghostly, compared to the thick, permanent markers used for the rest of the family. She let the sticky note drop back into place. It adhered perfectly, hiding her name once more. She didn't write a reminder for the dry cleaners on the calendar. She didn't write down her cap and gown pickup. She simply walked to the kitchen sink, turned on the tap, and watched the cold water run over her hands, washing away the smell of starch and hot metal. The morning light in the kitchen was always thin and gray before the sun cleared the neighbors' tall oak trees. At 7:12 a.m., the house was entirely silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the rhythmic, hollow drip of the kitchen faucet that Richard had been promising to fix since Thanksgiving. Clara stood at the counter, her fingers cold against the glass of the coffee carafe. This was her quietest hour, a small window of time before the rest of the household woke and filled the space with their demands, their schedules, and their noise. She measured the coffee grounds with absolute precision. 3 scoops of the dark roast for her father, 2 of the decaf hazelnut for her mother. She didn't make any for herself. Her stomach had been in tight, nervous knots since she woke up at 6, her mind running through the logistics of the morning like a train schedule. She placed the glass carafe onto the hot plate and pressed the power button. The machine cleared its throat with a loud, wet gasp, and then the slow, dark trickle began, filling the kitchen with the rich, heavy scent of hazelnut. Clara began setting out the mugs. It was a silent choreography she had memorized over years of quiet observation. Her father's mug was heavy, matte black, and always sat on the right side of the island. Her mother's was a delicate cream ceramic with her initials monogrammed in gold, placed next to the fruit bowl. Julian's Cornell alumni mug, the one he insisted on using even though he had graduated 3 years ago, went near the toaster. Maya's mug was an oversized pink cup with a chipped handle that she refused to let anyone throw away. Clara's own mug was not in the cupboard. It was still in her bedroom, sitting on her desk, holding 3 dried-up ballpoint pens and a pair of scissors. She hadn't used it for coffee in months. The floorboards creaked overhead. A door opened, followed by the heavy, shuffling footsteps of her father descending the stairs. Richard entered the kitchen wearing his gray fleece bathrobe, his eyes already fixed on the screen of his tablet. He walked straight to the coffee maker, completely bypassing Clara as she stood by the sink. He didn't look up when she stepped aside to give him room. "Is the dark roast done?" he asked, his voice thick with sleep. "Almost," Clara said. He stood there, waiting, his thumb flicking rhythmically across the tablet screen as he scrolled through financial news. The blue light from the device cast a pale glow over his face, highlighting the deep lines around his eyes. He didn't look at her, but his hand was already hovering near the matte black mug she had set out. "Your mother wants you to stop by the bakery next to the dry cleaners," Richard said, his tone casual, conversational, but entirely transactional. "Get some of those cinnamon rolls. Maya has that big meet today, and she likes to have something sweet before she goes." Clara watched the coffee drip. "The bakery on 4th? "Yeah, the one with the green awning." Richard reached for the coffee pot, pouring the dark liquid into his mug before the machine had fully finished brewing. A few stray drops fell onto the clean, hot plate, sizzling sharply and sending up a tiny wisp of bitter, burnt smoke. He didn't wipe it up. He just took a sip, his eyes still locked on his tablet. "Get half a dozen. Julian might want one too." Clara did a rapid mental calculation. The cinnamon rolls at the Green Awning Bakery were $5 each. A half dozen would be $30 plus tax. Her father had not reached into his bathrobe pocket for his wallet. He had not offered his credit card. He assumed, as he always did, that she would pay for it on her debit card and figure it out later. Later was a ledger that only existed in Clara's head. Over the last 4 years of college, she had spent hundreds of dollars on last-minute groceries, bakery runs, and pharmacy trips for the family. Whenever she tried to bring up the accumulated balance, her mother would laugh softly and say, "Oh, sweetie, we pay for your car insurance," or, "Just put it on the family tab," as if such a tab existed. Her checking account currently held $62. It was the remainder of her final work-study paycheck. If she spent $32 on cinnamon rolls and another $15 on gas to get across town to the university bookstore, she would be left with $15 to last her until she started her post-graduation internship in June. An internship her parents had barely acknowledged because it was at a local nonprofit rather than a corporate firm like Julian's. She looked at her father's profile. He was frowning at an article about interest rates. "Dad," Clara said, her voice quiet but clear, "I don't have enough cash on my card for the bakery today." Richard didn't look up from his tablet. He reached into his robe pocket, his fingers searching, but pulled them out empty. "Just charge it to your card, Clara. I'll Venmo you later." "You still haven't sent the money for Maya's project supplies from last week," she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a flat statement of fact. Her tone was completely devoid of anger, a product of her metabolic restraint. She was simply stating the physical limits of her bank account. Richard let out a small, irritated breath, his thumb pausing on the tablet. He finally looked up, his eyes meeting hers for a brief, impatient second. "Clara, please. I'm trying to read this report before Julian's breakfast meeting. It's $30. Just handle it, okay? We'll settle up tonight." Without waiting for her reply, he turned and walked toward the dining room, his mug in one hand and his tablet in the other. He didn't look back. Clara stood by the stove. The smell of the burnt coffee drippings on the hot plate was strong now, an acrid, sharp scent that clawed at the back of her throat. She picked up a damp sponge from the sink and wiped the hot plate. The sponge hissed, steam rising against her palm, hot and stinging. She didn't flinch. She wiped the surface clean, rinsed the sponge, and wrung it out until her knuckles turned white. She had exactly 19 minutes to get to the dry cleaners before the morning rush started. She grabbed her car keys from the hook by the door. Her fingers brushed against Maya's car keys, which were hanging on the adjacent hook, adorned with a fluffy pink keychain that Clara had bought her for her 17th birthday. Clara didn't take her purse. She only took her phone and her debit card, slipping them into the pocket of her worn denim jacket. As she stepped out into the garage, the heavy wooden door clicking shut behind her, the silence of the morning air hit her. It was cold, damp, and smelled of wet asphalt and early morning dew. She got into her 10-year-old sedan, the driver's side door closing with a heavy, metallic thud that echoed in the enclosed space of the garage. She inserted the key into the ignition. The engine coughed, sputtered, and then started with a loud, raspy whine that she knew Julian had complained about twice last week because it woke him up. Clara backed out of the driveway. In her rear-view mirror, she saw the lights in the master bedroom turn on. The house was waking up. The machine was starting to run, and she was already on her way to grease the wheels, using the very last of her own fuel to do it. The bell above the door of Miller's dry cleaning gave a brassy, metallic chime as Clara pushed her way inside. The air was thick, heavy with the sharp, chemical tang of perchloroethylene and the damp, humid heat of commercial presses at work behind the vinyl curtain. Behind the counter, the massive, motorized garment carousel sat still, a dense jungle of plastic-wrapped shoulders and wire hangers. Mrs. Gable, a woman whose face had been soft and lined by 30 years of neighborhood gossip, looked up from a ledger. She offered a warm, slow-blooming smile that stood in stark contrast to the transactional efficiency Clara had left behind at the kitchen island. "Well, morning, Clara," Mrs. Gable said, resting her forearms on the worn wooden counter. "You're up early for a Saturday. Usually your mother is the one rushing in here at the last second." "She's busy with Julian this morning," Clara said, her voice quiet in the echoing shop. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the yellow paper ticket she had retrieved from the kitchen corkboard the night before. "I'm here for Maya's blazer." Mrs. Gable took the ticket, her reading glasses sliding down the bridge of her nose as she scanned the number. "Ah, yes, the navy one with the gold buttons, for the athletic banquet, right?" She turned and pressed a black foot pedal on the floor. The carousel came to life with a loud mechanical clack, 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 whirr. The heavy rack groaned, hundreds of garments shifting in a slow, plastic-crinkling dance. Clara watched the clothes pass by, wool coats, formal dresses, expensive suits, all waiting for their moments, all catalogued and cared for by hands that were paid to remember. "You know," Mrs. Gable said over the racket of the machine, "I was just telling my husband last night that you must be finishing up at the college this month." I remember you bringing in those heavy wool skirts your freshman year. I graduate next Friday, Clara said. The carousel stopped with a sharp thud. Mrs. Gable parted the plastic sleeves, sliding Maya's pristine navy blazer off the metal bar. She hooked it over the wooden stand by the register. Next Friday, Mrs. Gable beamed, her eyes crinkling. Oh, that's wonderful, Clara. The first college graduate in the family, isn't it? I know Julian went to that big business school, but you did this while working, didn't you? Yes, I kept the work-study job at the library. Well, your parents must be absolutely over the moon, Mrs. Gable said, tapping the keys of the register. I expect Eleanor is planning a massive dinner. She's so good at those events. I still remember the spread she put out for Julian's graduation party. Those little puff pastries. Clara's gaze drifted to the gold buttons on Maya's blazer. They reflected the harsh fluorescent light of the shop, bright and cold. They're busy, Clara said softly. Julian has his new position starting, and Maya has her track regionals. Well, of course, but they wouldn't miss your graduation, Mrs. Gable said, her tone carrying the easy, unquestioning assumption of a mother who couldn't conceive of another way. She slid the blazer, still encased in its protective film, across the counter. There we go. No charge today. Your mother has the card on file. Thank you, Mrs. Gable. You have a wonderful day, Clara, and congratulations. You make sure they take plenty of pictures, you hear? Clara nodded, a tight, polite smile anchoring her lips in place. I will, thank you. She took the hanger. The wire was thin and cold, biting into the flesh of her index finger through the thin plastic shroud. She carried the blazer out of the shop, the brass bell chiming her departure. Outside, the smell of warm yeast, burnt sugar, and cinnamon from the bakery next door hung thick in the damp morning air. A line of 5 people had already formed on the sidewalk under the green awning. Clara looked at her phone. A text message from Maya had arrived 3 minutes ago. Make sure they didn't crease the sleeves of the blazer. And tell me you got the rolls. Dad said you were going. Get the ones with the extra cream cheese icing, not the regular glaze. Julian wants 2. Clara stared at the screen. The glare of the morning sun made the text hard to read, the white letters washing out against the gray background. She stood on the sidewalk, the wire hanger resting heavy in her hand. If she got in the bakery line now, it would take at least 15 minutes. By the time she ordered, paid the $30 she couldn't afford to spend, and drove back, she would have to rush to the campus bookstore. The line for cap and gown pickup was notorious on the final Saturday. If she got caught behind the rush, she might not make it back before Eleanor and Richard returned from their breakfast with Julian's new vice president. If she didn't get the rolls, Maya would complain. Her father would look disappointed, making some passive-aggressive comment about how hard it is to get a simple favor done around here. Clara looked at her debit card balance on her banking app. Available balance, $62.14. She looked at the bakery line. Then she looked at Maya's text again. A quiet, cold calculation settled in her chest. For years, her daily energy had been spent minimizing the friction in the house, smoothing over their disappointments, anticipating their needs, absorbing their irritation so the household could run without a hitch. She had spent her own money, her own time, her own sleep, just to keep the peace. But next Friday was her graduation, and nobody had even asked her what time the ceremony started. Clara turned her back on the bakery. She walked to her car, opened the back door, and carefully laid Maya's blazer flat across the rear seat, ensuring the plastic didn't catch on the door handle. She climbed into the driver's seat, pulled her seatbelt across her chest, and turned the key. The engine coughed its familiar, raspy protest before settling into a rough, vibrating idle. She shifted the car into drive and pulled out of the parking lot, steering away from the bakery, away from the suburban neighborhood, and toward the highway that led to the university campus. The phone on her dashboard buzzed again, the screen lighting up with a call from her mother. Clara didn't reach for it. She watched the green light of the signal ahead turn yellow, then red. She pressed her foot to the brake, letting the car roll to a smooth, silent stop, and watched the windshield wipers sweep away a single, stray drop of morning rain. The basement of the university bookstore smelled of stale cardboard, floor wax, and the sharp synthetic scent of hundreds of freshly unpacked polyester graduation gowns. Fluorescent tubes hummed overhead, casting a clinical, washed-out light over the concrete floor, where a long line of seniors shuffled forward. Clara stood near the back of the line, her hands buried deep in the pockets of her denim jacket. Around her, the air was thick with the high-pitched energy of young people on the cusp of something major. Two girls ahead of her were laughing, showing each other photos on their phones of the dresses they planned to wear under their gowns. Behind her, a tall guy in a varsity jacket was talking to his mother on speakerphone, his voice echoing off the low ceiling as they argued playfully about how many restaurant reservations they needed for graduation weekend. "Mom, I told you, Uncle Tommy is coming with his kids, so we need a table for 10, the boy said, rolling his eyes but smiling. "Yeah, I know. Just book it at the steakhouse." Clara stared at the back of his jacket. She felt a dull, hollow sensation in her chest, not quite sharp enough to be pain, but heavy enough to slow her breathing. Her family hadn't discussed dinner for next Friday. There had been no mention of a reservation, no family text thread about who was driving, no coordination of schedules. The only event on the calendar for that weekend was Julian's celebratory barbecue on Sunday, which Eleanor had spent the last 3 weeks meticulously planning, down to ordering custom napkins with his new corporate logo printed on them. The line moved forward 3 paces. Clara's sneakers squeaked softly on the polished concrete. She pulled her left hand out of her pocket and checked her phone. There were 3 missed calls now, 2 from Eleanor, 1 from Maya. A string of text messages sat on her lock screen, their preview stacking up in a neat, demanding column. Eleanor. "Clara, where are you? The cleaners said you picked up the blazer an hour ago. Maya needs to get dressed." Eleanor. "Clara, please answer. We're leaving for the breakfast in 10 minutes and Maya is throwing a fit because her blazer isn't in her closet." Maya. "Where are you? I need my jacket now." Clara looked at the time at the top of her screen, 9:14 a.m. If she replied now, if she explained that she was at the university bookstore picking up her cap and gown, the response would be immediate and predictable. Eleanor would be exasperated. "Why didn't you do that later, Clara? You knew Maya needed that blazer first thing. You could have gone on Monday." They wouldn't care that Monday was the start of final exams, or that the pickup window closed today. To them, her presence at the bookstore was an inconvenient side quest, a personal chore she had selfishly prioritized over a family necessity. She did a quick calculation. If she kept her phone on silent, she would face an unpleasant conversation when she got home. But if she answered now, she would spend her entire 30-minute drive home listening to her mother's frantic, guilt-inducing voice over the car speakers. The silence she had right now, in this crowded, noisy basement, was the only peace she was going to get all day. She swiped her finger across the screen, turning the ringer off completely, and slipped the phone back into her pocket. "Next," a tired voice called out from the front of the line. Clara stepped up to the folding table. A student worker with dark circles under his eyes and a university logo lanyard around his neck looked up at her, holding a black scanner. "Name?" he muttered. Clara Vance. He tapped her name into the laptop, his fingers clicking rapidly on the keyboard. ID? Clara pulled her student ID card from her pocket and slid it across the table. The plastic was worn, the photo taken 4 years ago during her freshman orientation. She looked so much younger in the picture, her eyes brighter, her smile wider, completely unaware of the sheer volume of silent labor it would take to drag herself to the finish line of this degree. The scanner beeped, a sharp, clean sound. "Okay, Clara," the worker said, reaching into a large cardboard box behind him. He pulled out a heavy plastic bag containing a folded black gown, a square mortarboard cap, and a plastic-wrapped tassel with a brass 2026 charm dangling from the center. He set them on the table and slid a clipboard toward her. "Sign here to confirm receipt." Clara took the cheap ballpoint pen. Her hand was steady as she signed her name on the lined paper ledger, her signature falling directly below 50 other names of students who had already picked up their futures that morning. "Congratulations," the worker said. It was a mechanical, scripted greeting, delivered without any real inflection, but as Clara took the heavy plastic bag into her arms, the word felt surprisingly heavy. "Thank you," she said softly. She tucked the plastic bag under her arm, holding it tightly against her ribs like a shield. The cheap polyester felt stiff and cold through the plastic, but to Clara, it was the most tangible thing she owned. She had paid for every thread of it with her own money, earned during the late-night shifts at the university library, shelving books while her family slept, studying under the dim desk lamp when the campus was quiet. As she walked up the concrete stairs and out into the bright, damp morning air, her phone vibrated in her pocket. She didn't pull it out. She stood on the plaza, looking at the stone archway of the campus gates. A few families were already taking photos near the university sign, parents adjusting their children's collars, fathers holding cameras, mothers wiping away tears. Clara adjusted her grip on her gown, turned toward the parking lot, and began the long walk back to her car. The automatic garage door rolled upward with a heavy metallic groan that vibrated through the frame of Clara's sedan. She pulled into the dark bay, parking in her usual spot next to the towering metal shelving units stacked with plastic bins of old holiday decorations, Julian's discarded sports gear, and boxes of Maya's childhood dance costumes. Clara turned off the ignition. The engine died with a soft, ticking sigh of cooling metal. She sat in the dim garage for a moment, her hands resting on the steering wheel. In the back seat, Maya's navy blazer hung from the grab handle, its plastic wrapping catching the faint light filtering through the garage windows. Beside her, on the passenger seat, lay the heavy cardboard box containing her cap and gown. She picked up the box, tucking it under her left arm, and reached into the back to grab the wire hanger of the dry-cleaned blazer with her right hand. When she pushed open the heavy wooden door leading into the kitchen, the wall of warm, frantic household energy hit her immediately. "I don't care, Mom. I'm not wearing the gray sweatpants. They make my legs look short, and the scout from State is going to be there." Maya's voice shrieked from the hallway, followed by the heavy stomping sound of her running up the stairs. Eleanor was standing by the kitchen island, frantically searching through her leather handbag. She looked up as Clara entered, her expression instantly shifting from distraction to sharp, pointed annoyance. "Clara, where on earth have you been?" Eleanor took 2 quick steps toward her, reaching out to snatch the blazer from Clara's hand. She didn't look at Clara's face. Her eyes were already scanning the garment through the plastic. "Maya has been having a complete meltdown. We were supposed to leave 10 minutes ago. Your father is already in the car." "The traffic on the bridge was backed up," Clara said. Her voice was flat, level, entirely devoid of the nervous, apologetic tone she usually adopted when the family was stressed. Eleanor sighed, a sharp huff of air as she checked the buttons on the blazer. "And the bakery? Where are the cinnamon rolls? Maya hasn't eaten anything but a piece of toast, and she's going to have no energy for the hurdles." "I didn't go to the bakery," Clara said. Eleanor stopped. She finally looked up, her eyebrows knitting together in genuine confusion. "What do you mean you didn't go? Your father told you to grab them." "The line was around the block," Clara said, her expression perfectly blank. "If I had waited, I wouldn't have made it back with the blazer in time." It was a partial truth, a shield constructed from the family's own frantic timeline. Clara watched her mother process the statement. Eleanor's mouth opened slightly, as if she wanted to argue, to point out that Clara should have gone earlier, or that she should have just waited anyway. But the ticking of the kitchen clock, now reading 10:28 a.m., overrode her capacity for a prolonged lecture. "Well, honestly, Clara," Eleanor muttered, turning away to drape the blazer over the back of a kitchen chair, "a little planning would have gone a long way. Now we're going to have to stop at a drive-thru on the highway, and you know how greasy that food is for her." She picked up her purse from the counter, her eyes briefly falling on the large, white cardboard box tucked under Clara's arm. "What is that?" Eleanor asked, her tone distracted, already checking her reflection in the microwave door. Clara looked down at the box. Inside was the black polyester gown that represented 4 years of solitary, unassisted effort. She calculated the energy required to explain it, to hear Eleanor say, "Oh, that's nice, sweetie. We'll talk about that later." Or worse, to watch her mother look at the calendar and realize what she had forgotten, triggering a wave of performative, rushed guilt. "Just some library books," Clara said. "I have to return them before the term ends." "Oh, right," Eleanor said, not questioning the explanation for a single second. "Well, make sure you put them away. The kitchen island is a mess." Eleanor didn't notice the sticky puddle of maple syrup drying on the white marble counter where Julian had eaten his breakfast, or the empty orange juice carton sitting next to the sink. She didn't notice the 3 dirty mugs left in the strainer. She simply adjusted her collar, grabbed Maya's blazer, and headed toward the hallway. "Maya, Clara has the blazer! Get down here right now!" Eleanor screamed toward the stairs, her voice fading as she walked away. Clara stood alone in the kitchen. The house was a storm of departing noise. Maya's heavy footsteps bounded down the stairs, followed by a brief, muttered complaint about the dry cleaning smell on her collar. The front door opened, letting in a rush of warm, humid air, and then slammed shut. Outside, the car doors clicked shut one by one, and her father's SUV backed down the driveway, the sound of the engine fading into the quiet of the suburban street. Then there was only silence. Clara stood in the center of the kitchen. The quiet of the empty house felt vast, almost physical, settling over the rooms like dust. She looked at the kitchen island. The dried syrup had formed a hard, translucent amber crust on the marble. Beside it lay Julian's crumpled napkin and a scattering of crumbs from his toast. Usually, this was when Clara would clean. She would wipe down the counters, wash the sticky dishes, empty the trash, and make sure the house was pristine before they returned, exhausted and loud from their various triumphs. She would do it because she hated the clutter, but also because she had always believed, somewhere deep down, that a clean house was a form of love they would eventually recognize. She looked at the sponge sitting in the sink. She didn't pick it up. Clara turned and walked out of the kitchen, carrying the heavy cardboard box up the stairs. Her footsteps made no sound on the carpeted steps. When she reached her bedroom, she shut the door, turning the small brass lock until it clicked. She walked over to her closet, pushed aside the winter coats she hadn't worn in months, and placed the cardboard box on the very top shelf, in the dark, dusty corner behind an old duffel bag. She stood there, staring at the blank white cardboard in the shadows, before slowly closing the closet door. The late afternoon sun cast long amber bars across Clara's bedroom floor, illuminating the tiny dust motes suspended in the quiet air. Clara sat on the edge of her bed, her knees pulled slightly toward her chest. In front of her, on the mattress, lay a small, accordion-style plastic file folder she had purchased at the university bookstore. She was systematically organizing her documents. One by one, she slid them into the labeled pockets: her birth certificate, her social security card, her immunization records, her car title, and the thin paper receipts from her 4 years of work-study payroll. These were her quiet proofs of existence, the ledger of her independence, all weighing less than 2 pounds. Downstairs, the garage door rumbled open, its heavy vibration rattling the window pane in her room. The silence of the house shattered instantly. The heavy front door slammed, followed by the clatter of Maya's heavy track spikes being dropped onto the hardwood floor of the foyer, a habit she had never been broken of despite Eleanor's constant half-hearted nagging. "I told you, Richard, we should have taken the bypass." Eleanor's voice carried up the stairs, tight and sharp with travel fatigue. "Now we're going to be late for the pre-registration call, and I haven't even had a glass of water." "The bypass was backed up too, Eleanor," Richard's voice grumbled, his heavy footsteps moving toward the den. "Just let me sit down for 5 minutes." Clara didn't move. She listened to the auditory decay of their return, the rustle of plastic shopping bags, the dull thud of Maya's duffel bag hit the bottom step of the stairs, the high-pitched chirp of the security system keypad being armed. Then came the silence, a heavy, expectant pause. Clara closed the flap of her accordion folder, the plastic buckle snapping shut with a sharp, clean click. She slid it under her bed, pushing it deep into the shadows beneath the dust ruffle. "Clara?" Eleanor's voice called out from the bottom of the stairs. It wasn't a warm greeting, it was a summons. "Clara, are you up there?" Clara stood up, smoothed her jeans, and unlocked her door. She walked down the stairs slowly, her hand gliding lightly along the wooden banister. Eleanor was standing in the center of the kitchen, still wearing her sunglasses pushed up onto her head. She was staring at the kitchen island. The sticky puddle of maple syrup from breakfast had dried completely, forming a dull, dark ring on the white marble. Next to it sat Julian's empty orange juice carton, its cardboard spout gaping open. The 3 dirty mugs still sat in the sink, the residue of coffee having dried into dark, bitter rings at the bottom of the ceramic. Eleanor turned her head as Clara stepped into the kitchen. Her expression was a mix of exhaustion and genuine, irritated disbelief. "Clara," Eleanor said, gesturing vaguely toward the counter, "what happened in here? You've been home all afternoon." "I was in my room," Clara said quietly. "But the kitchen is exactly how we left it," Eleanor said, her voice rising slightly in pitch. "The counter is sticky. There are dishes in the sink. I thought you were going to clean up before we got back." "I didn't have time," Clara said. Eleanor blinked. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in her eyes, the first crack in her assumption that Clara's time was a naturally replenishing resource. "You didn't have time? What were you doing? Maya's meat took 6 hours. Surely you could have wiped the counter." "I had to study," Clara said. Her voice remained perfectly level, lacking any defensive edge. I have 3 finals next week. Well, we all have things to do, Clara, Eleanor said, her tone tightening. She pulled her sunglasses down, placing them on the sticky counter with a sharp tap. But we still have to keep the house running. Your sister is starving, and your father's back is acting up from the drive. What's the plan for dinner? Clara looked at the empty stove. Usually, on a Saturday night after a track meet, Clara would have already defrosted chicken, chopped vegetables, or at least had the local Italian restaurant on speed dial, ready to coordinate everyone's custom orders. She would have set the table, poured the water, and stood by to clean up as they ate. She looked at her mother. Eleanor's face was set in a familiar pattern of weaponized expectation. She was waiting for Clara to feel the weight of their discomfort, to apologize, and to say, "Let me see what's in the fridge. I'll whip something up." Clara calculated the energy. If she cooked, she would spend the next hour over a hot stove, only to watch them eat in front of the television, leaving her with another sink full of dishes that they would ignore. If she didn't, Eleanor would be annoyed. Maya would slam her bedroom door, and the house would feel cold. But the coldness didn't hurt her anymore. It was just temperature. "I didn't make a plan," Clara said. Eleanor's mouth tightened into a thin, pale line. "You didn't make a plan? Clara, what is wrong with you today? First the bakery this morning, and now this? You're acting incredibly selfish." "There are eggs in the fridge," Clara said, her tone polite but entirely detached. "And some bread." "Eggs?" Eleanor repeated the word as if Clara had suggested they eat lawn clippings. "After a 6-hour track meet? Maya needs actual protein, Clara, not scrambled eggs." "Then you can order a pizza," Clara said. She turned and began to walk back toward the stairs. "Clara!" Eleanor called after her, her voice sharp with genuine shock. "We are a family. We don't just fend for ourselves like roommates. I expect a little more cooperation from you." Clara didn't stop. She didn't look back. She climbed the stairs, her steps rhythmic and unhurried. Behind her, she heard the sharp, angry rustle of Eleanor opening the refrigerator door, followed by the loud, clinking sound of jars being shifted in frustration. "Richard!" Eleanor called out toward the den, her voice laced with a new, sharp strain of annoyance. "Richard, you're going to have to order something. Clara didn't make dinner." Clara reached the top landing, walked into her room, and shut the door. She didn't lock it this time. She didn't need to. The quiet boundary she had drawn in the kitchen was heavier than any brass bolt. By 8:45 p.m., the house smelled of grease, stale garlic, and lukewarm cardboard. The family had ordered Chinese takeout. No one had knocked on Clara's door to ask what she wanted, and she hadn't expected them to. They had eaten in the dining room, their voices carrying up the stairs in a muffled, tense rumble of clinking silverware and occasional, sharp bursts of laughter that felt more defensive than genuine. Now, the house had quieted down. The television in the den was murmurous, a low drone of a late-night talk show. Clara came downstairs. The kitchen was dark, illuminated only by the pale green glow of the microwave clock showing 8:54 p.m. and the faint street lamp light filtering through the window above the sink. On the dining table, the white cardboard takeout containers lay open, their wire handles bent, greasy residue smeared around the rims. A half-eaten spring roll sat on a paper plate, a pool of plum sauce turning sticky and dark under the air conditioning vent. The empty soda cans stood like tin sentinels around the clutter. Clara didn't clean it. She didn't touch a single cardboard box. She walked to the pantry, her bare feet silent on the cold tile. She pulled out a single sleeve of saltine crackers and a jar of peanut butter. She grabbed a small white ceramic plate, the smallest one she could find, and a butter knife. Standing by the counter, she carefully spread peanut butter over 3 crackers, her movements deliberate and slow. The scraping of the knife against the dry saltine was the only sound in the dark room, a tiny, scratchy whisper. "Clara?" She didn't jump. She finished spreading the peanut butter on the 3rd cracker, set the knife down on the edge of her plate, and turned around. Julian was standing in the doorway of the kitchen, his tall frame silhouetted against the light from the hallway. He was wearing his gray university hoodie, his phone held loosely in his right hand. He looked at her, his eyes squinting slightly in the dim light. "What are you doing in the dark?" he asked. "Eating," Clara said. Julian walked over to the refrigerator, his shoulder brushing against hers as he passed. He opened the door, the bright interior bulb flooding the kitchen with a cold, white glare that made Clara squint. He rumbled through the shelves, moving jars of mustard and mayonnaise aside with a heavy, careless hand before pulling out a bottle of imported beer. He popped the cap off using the opener mounted to the wall, the metal crown clinking as it dropped into the small catch basket below. He took a long sip, then leaned against the counter, looking down at her plate. "Mom's in a mood," Julian said, his tone carrying a light, half-amused irritation. "She said you were being weird about dinner. What's up with that?" "Nothing," Clara said, taking a bite of her cracker. The salt was sharp on her tongue, dry and clean. "You usually make that lemon chicken on Saturdays," Julian said, shifting his weight. "We had to get that cheap place down the street. The rice was dry." He spoke as if the dry rice were a personal slight, an administrative error that Clara was responsible for correcting. He didn't ask how her classes were, or how her final prep was going. To him, her absence at the dinner table was simply a break in the standard operating procedure of the household. "I have exams," Clara said. "Yeah, well, we all have stuff," Julian said, waving his beer bottle slightly. "Hey, listen, I've got that presentation for the regional partners on Tuesday. I emailed you the slide deck. Can you look over the copy? Just check the grammar and make sure the formatting doesn't look clunky. I need it back by Sunday night." He smiled, the easy, confident smile of a brother who had spent his entire life asking for favors and receiving them without question. He had always used Clara as his personal editor, his proofreader, his administrative assistant. During his college years, she had spent entire weekends rewriting his essays while he was out at fraternity parties, because Eleanor had begged her to help your brother out. He's under so much pressure. Clara looked at her plate. 2 crackers left. She did a quick calculation. Reviewing Julian's deck would take at least 3 hours. It would mean squinting at his poorly written corporate jargon, correcting his passive voice, and aligning his messy margins while her own notes on developmental psychology sat unread on her desk. In the past, she would have done it, hoping for a quick, "Thanks, you're the best," before he slid back into his comfortable pattern of ignoring her. "No," Clara said. The kitchen fell completely silent. The refrigerator's compressor kicked on, a low industrial hum that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. Julian's smile didn't vanish immediately. It froze, his lips twitching slightly. He tilted his head as if he hadn't quite understood the word. "What do you mean, no?" "I can't do it," Clara said, her voice even and quiet. "I have my own work." "It's just 30 slides, Clara," Julian said, his tone dropping into a sharper, more demanding register. "It'll take you 20 minutes. I'll even Venmo you $20 if you're that stressed about it." "I don't have the time," Clara said. Julian stared at her. For the first time in years, he was actually looking at her, but there was no warmth in his gaze, only a growing defensive confusion. His sister, the quiet middle child who always said yes, who always ironed his shirts, who always smoothed over their mother's anxiety, was refusing him. "You're being really difficult lately," Julian muttered, his fingers tightening around the neck of his beer bottle. He took another sip, his jaw clenching as he swallowed. "I don't get what your problem is. It's one favor." Clara picked up her small white plate. She didn't argue. She didn't remind him of the dozens of essays she had written for him, or the resumes she had polished, or the fact that her own graduation was 6 days away and he hadn't even asked if she wanted him to be there. "Good night, Julian," she said softly. She walked past him, her shoulder avoiding his by a fraction of an inch, and stepped out of the bright white glare of the refrigerator light. She carried her plate up the stairs, leaving him standing in the dark kitchen next to the greasy takeout boxes and the dried pool of plum sauce. Sunday morning brought the faint, metallic scent of rain through the open window of the laundry room. Clara stood before the washing machine, her hands sorting through a small pile of her own clothes. Dark jeans, 3 plain cotton t-shirts, and the thick knit cardigan she wore when the library's air conditioning was turned up too high. It was a meager pile, barely enough to cover the bottom of the stainless steel drum. Beside the machine sat 2 large, overflowing plastic hampers. One was filled with Julian's grass-stained golf shirts and heavy denim. The other overflowed with Maya's bright neon track jerseys and damp, mud-flecked socks. Usually, Clara's Sunday routine began at 7 in the morning. She would sort the whites, the darks, the delicates, running 4 consecutive loads to ensure everyone had their clean wardrobes ready for the week ahead. She would measure the fabric softener, transfer the heavy, wet bundles to the dryer, and spend her afternoon folding everything into neat, geometric stacks to place outside their respective bedroom doors. Today, Clara reached past the family's hampers. Her movements were slow, rhythmic, and quiet. She picked up a bottle of unscented, dye-free detergent, the one she had purchased with her own work-study cash because her skin was sensitive to the heavily perfumed brand her mother bought in bulk. She poured a single, precise half-cap of the blue liquid, watching it thread into the cold water as the tub began to fill. "Clara?" Eleanor stood in the doorway, holding a stack of dirty kitchen towels. Her hair was pulled back into a messy clip, and she looked slightly rumpled, her face carrying the faint, tight strain of a Sunday morning that was already falling behind schedule. She looked at Clara, then down at the 2 untouched hampers, and finally at the small, sparse load turning in the machine. "Why aren't you running Julian's shirts?" Eleanor asked, her hand resting on the doorframe. "He's trying to pack his suitcase for the trip to the corporate office, and he says he doesn't have his blue linen one." "It's in his hamper," Clara said, her voice barely rising above the sound of the rushing water. "Well, why isn't it in the wash?" Eleanor's tone carried a sharp, impatient edge. She stepped into the narrow room, dropping the kitchen towels onto the dryer with a dull thump. "You're running a load right now. You should have put his things in with yours. It's a waste of water to run the machine half empty." Clara adjusted the dial on the washing machine to small load. The mechanical click was loud in the small space. "My clothes are delicates," Clara said. "They can't be washed with his heavy denim." "Then run his load next," Eleanor said, her voice rising slightly. "He needs to leave by 4 this afternoon, Clara, and Maya's track uniforms are still sitting in her bag from yesterday. They're going to mildew if they aren't washed soon." Clara looked at her mother. There was a faint smudge of newsprint on Eleanor's thumb, and she was tapping her foot against the linoleum floor, a rapid, nervous tick. She wasn't asking Clara to help. She was assigning a duty, operating under the deeply ingrained assumption that Clara's role in the house was to absorb the dirty laundry, the dirty dishes, and the disorganized schedules of everyone else, leaving them clean and orderly. Clara did a quick mental calculation. If she washed Julian's clothes and Maya's uniforms, she would spend her entire Sunday morning in the laundry room, carrying heavy baskets up and down the stairs, folding garments that would be snatched away without a second thought. She would lose the quiet hours she needed to review her research methods notes for her Monday morning exam. And more than that, she would be reinforcing the invisible tether that bound her to their convenience. "I have to go to the library as soon as this load is done," Clara said quietly. "I won't be here to transfer their clothes to the dryer." Eleanor's foot stopped tapping. She stared at Clara, her eyes narrowing as a slow, cold wave of irritation settled over her features. This was the third time in 24 hours that Clara had offered a flat, polite refusal. The subtle shifts in her daughter's behavior were no longer just a bad mood. They were beginning to look like a deliberate, quiet rebellion. "What is going on with you, Clara?" Eleanor asked, her voice dropping into a low, defensive register. "First the bakery, then dinner last night, and now you can't even run a load of laundry for your brother? He is leaving for a major career step today. This is a big deal for him." "My finals are a big deal for me," Clara said. Her voice was remarkably steady, lacking any tremor of anger or resentment. It was simply a statement of equal weight, though she knew her mother would never perceive it as such. "We all support you, Clara, but you live in this house too," Eleanor said, her tone tightening. "You can't just opt out of the family because you have a few tests. We all have to make sacrifices. Your father and I have done everything to make sure you kids have what you need. The laundry will be here when you get back from Julian's send-off lunch," Clara said. "The instructions for the delicate cycle are on the cabinet door." Eleanor blinked, her mouth opening slightly in genuine shock. For years, Clara had been the buffer, the one who stepped in to prevent Eleanor from getting overwhelmed by the domestic chaos. To suggest that Eleanor, or Julian, or Maya simply do the laundry themselves was a foreign, jarring concept. It was a crack in the foundation of their daily convenience. "You are being incredibly selfish lately," Eleanor said, her voice trembling slightly with a mixture of anger and confusion. "I don't know who you think you're punishing, but it's not fair to your brother." She snatched her stack of kitchen towels off the dryer, turned sharply, and walked out of the room, her slippers slapping loudly against the hardwood floor of the hallway. Clara stood alone in the small room. The washing machine shifted into its agitation cycle, the heavy chug, chug, chug of the motor filling the space with a steady, rhythmic vibration. She reached out and closed the lid. The machine swallowed the blue detergent, the cold water, and her small, dark pile of clothes, turning them over and over in the dark. She leaned against the dryer, feeling the cold metal through her jeans. The smell of lavender fabric softener from Eleanor's towels lingered in the air, sweet and suffocating. But Clara's own clothes would smell of nothing at all. They would be clean, and they would be hers. The yellow highlighter squeaked softly as Clara drew a clean, transparent line of neon color across a paragraph on cognitive development theories. She sat at her small wooden desk, her bedroom window cracked open just an inch to let in the cool, damp air of the late Sunday afternoon. From 2 stories down, the muffled sounds of the driveway floated up, the heavy thud of an SUV trunk closing, the high-pitched chirp of a car alarm being set, and the loud, cheerful pitch of Eleanor's voice bidding Julian goodbye. Clara didn't rise to look. She kept her eyes on the page, her hands steady as she turned to the next sheet of her legal pad, her mechanical pencil scratching out a summary of the next chapter. Make sure you text us when you get to the hotel, Julian. Eleanor's voice drifted through the glass, carrying a desperate, fluttery warmth. And don't forget to eat some real food, not just those corporate snacks. I'll be fine, Mom, Julian's muffled baritone replied, followed by the deep, throaty rumble of his car engine starting up. Clara turned another page. Her desk was a model of silent, self-contained efficiency. To the left sat her stack of library textbooks, each one carrying a small white barcode sticker. To the right, a neat pile of her study guides, her final papers, and the small dark blue folder containing her signed lease agreement for a tiny studio apartment downtown. She had signed the lease 3 days ago. It was a small, third-floor walk-up, barely 400 square feet, with a rusted radiator that clanked and a window that overlooked a narrow brick alley. The rent was $700 a month, nearly everything she would make from her upcoming nonprofit internship, supplemented by the remaining savings from her library work-study job. It was a tight, precarious budget that left no room for error, no money for dining out, and absolutely no margin for emergencies. She did a quick calculation on the margin of her legal pad. After her security deposit and first month's rent cleared on May 15th, the day after her graduation, she would have exactly $84.12 left in her savings account. She would have to live on ramen, peanut butter, and the free apples left in the break room at the library for at least 3 weeks until her first internship stipend check arrived. It was a terrifyingly thin line to walk, but as she stared at the numbers, she felt no panic. She only felt a deep, quiet sense of relief. $84 of her own money was infinitely more valuable than $1,000 of her father's reluctant settling up cash. Outside, the tires of Julian's SUV crunched over the gravel as he backed out of the driveway, the sound of his engine fading as he turned onto the main road. The house below fell quiet again, but it was a heavy, resentful quiet. A few minutes later, the front door slammed, and the sound of Eleanor's footsteps echoed in the hallway, sharp and hurried. A soft knock sounded on Clara's door. It wasn't a gentle request. It was a firm, rhythmic rapping that demanded entry. Clara didn't stand up. "Come in." The door swung open, and Eleanor stood in the threshold. She had changed into a pair of soft gray lounge pants, but her shoulders were still tense, her face carrying the lingering irritation of a woman whose domestic clockwork had been disrupted. She held a single sheet of paper in her hand. "Clara," Eleanor said, her voice dropping into a dry, businesslike tone. "Your father and I are trying to coordinate the calendar for the rest of the month. Maya has her regional track finals next Friday morning, and then we have the Booster Club dinner on Saturday night." She stepped into the room, her eyes briefly scanning the neat stacks of books on Clara's desk, but they didn't linger. She laid the sheet of paper down on the edge of the dresser. "I need you to handle the grocery run on Thursday," Eleanor continued, her tone carrying the casual, dismissive authority of a manager delegating a minor chore. "We're hosting the team breakfast on Saturday morning before the banquet, and I need at least 4 cartons of eggs, 3 packages of bacon, and the large orange juice bottles. I've written it all down." Clara looked at her mother. Eleanor was looking at the closet door, her hand already moving to adjust her hair. She wasn't looking at Clara's face. She didn't notice the neat, organized file folder peeking out from under the bed, or the fact that Clara's graduation gown was hanging in the dark corner of the closet. And she completely missed the significance of the date she had just mentioned. Next Friday morning, May 14th. "I can't do the grocery run on Thursday," Clara said. Her voice was remarkably soft, almost conversational, but it had the solid, unyielding quality of stone. Eleanor's hand froze near her temple. She slowly turned her head, her eyes locking onto Clara's with a cold, defensive sharpness. Excuse me? Clara, it's a simple grocery run. You don't have classes on Thursday afternoons. I have my final research presentation on Thursday afternoon, Clara said, and I have to prepare for Friday morning. Friday morning? Eleanor repeated, her brow furrowing in genuine, irritated confusion. What is on Friday morning? I told you, Maya has her regional finals. We're all going to be at the stadium. The words hung in the quiet room, cold and sharp. Clara stared at her mother. The silence that followed was dense, suffocating, and absolute. The tick of the desk clock seemed to amplify, each second a heavy hammer strike in the quiet space between them. Eleanor's expression didn't soften into realization. There was no sudden gasp of memory, no rushed apology, no frantic checking of her phone calendar. There was only a hard, impatient expectation that Clara would explain her schedule, as if she were a child making up an excuse to get out of a chore. My college graduation is next Friday morning, Clara said. The silence returned, heavier this time, pressing down on the room like a physical weight. The silence in the bedroom seemed to expand, pressing against the walls until the air felt thin and cold. Eleanor stood frozen in the doorway, her mouth slightly open. Her eyes, which had been darting around the room with habitual impatience, suddenly locked onto Clara's face. For 3 agonizing seconds, she didn't speak. She didn't move. Then, the defensive pivot began. It was a subtle, physical shift, the squaring of her shoulders, the slight tilt of her chin, the soft, fluttering laugh that she always used to smooth over her own mistakes. Oh, sweetie, Eleanor said, her voice rising in a high, breathy pitch of performative warmth. She stepped further into the room, her hands fluttering in front of her chest. Of course it is. I knew it was. Well, I knew it was sometime this month. But next Friday? The 14th? Oh, Clara, why didn't you say something sooner? Clara didn't blink. She quietly picked up her mechanical pencil, placing it back into the precise groove of her desk organizer. She aligned the edges of her legal pad, tapping the paper against the wood until the stack was perfectly flush. It's been on the master calendar for 3 months, Mom, Clara said. Her voice was flat, level, completely devoid of accusation. Well, yes, but you know how chaotic things have been, Eleanor said, her tone instantly shifting into a defensive, hurried explanation. She pulled her phone from her pocket, her thumbs flying across the screen as she pulled up her digital calendar. With Julian's promotion and his relocation, and Maya's track regionals, your father has been working 90 hours a week, and I've been running on absolute fumes. If you had just dropped a text, or put a bright red note on the fridge. She was shifting the weight of the mistake. It was a practiced maneuver, one Clara had watched her mother perform 100 times. If something went wrong, it wasn't because Eleanor had forgotten, it was because someone else hadn't reminded her loudly enough. Let me look at the schedule, Eleanor muttered, her eyes scanning her screen. Her brow furrowed, and her finger hovered over the glass. Oh dear. She stopped scrolling. The silence returned, heavy and awkward. Clara watched her mother's face. She saw the exact moment Eleanor realized the physical impossibility of her day. Maya's regional track finals, the ones the scout from state was attending, began at 9 a.m. at the athletic complex 40 miles north. Clara's university commencement began at 10 a.m. at the campus stadium, 30 miles in the opposite direction. Maya's hurdles are at 9:15, Eleanor whispered, her eyes still glued to her screen as if she could force the digital numbers to rearrange themselves. And she has the relay at 11:30. Your father has to drive her because the team bus is full, and I'm supposed to coordinate the parent hospitality tent. Oh, Clara, the traffic on the interstate on a Friday morning is going to be absolute murder. She looked up from her phone, her expression a fragile mask of polite distress. She was using that soft, pleading tone, the weaponized incompetence that allowed her to look like the victim of a scheduling conflict, rather than a mother who had simply forgotten her middle child's milestone. "Why do they have to host these things on the same day?" Eleanor sighed, letting her hand drop to her side. "It's like the university doesn't even think about families with multiple children. It's so inconsiderate." She paused, waiting. She was waiting for Clara to do what she always did. She was waiting for Clara to see her mother's distress, to feel the weight of the family's conflict, and to offer the easy, self-sacrificing way out. She wanted Clara to say, "It's okay, Mom. You should go to Maya's meet. It's not a big deal." Clara did a quick internal calculation. If she begged them to come, if she insisted that her father or her mother split the day, what would it look like? Eleanor would arrive late, flustered and sighing, checking her phone every 3 minutes to see how Maya's hurdles went. She would complain about the parking, the heat, and the length of the speeches. Richard would sit there, looking at his watch, anxious to get back to his home office. It would be a day defined by their reluctant, guilt-driven presence. Their physical bodies might be in the stadium seats, but their minds would be 40 miles north. The emotional cost of forcing them to care was a debt Clara was no longer willing to carry. Her dignity was worth more than a rushed, distracted photo in the parking lot with a family that had to be guilted into showing up. "You don't have to come," Clara said. Eleanor blinked, a tiny, involuntary flicker of relief washing over her features, before she quickly pulled her mask of maternal concern back into place. "Oh, Clara, no, don't say that. We want to support you. It's just, the timing is so incredibly difficult." "I'm serious, Mom," Clara said, her voice quiet and steady. "Maya's meet is important. The scouts are going to be there. You should go." But your graduation," Eleanor said, her voice carrying a fragile, performative protest. "The first college graduate. We should be there. Maybe your father can drop Maya off and then drive down to the campus, though he'd miss the actual ceremony." "No," Clara said, cutting through the empty logistics with a cold, clean stroke. "I'd prefer to go alone anyway." The words hit the room with a soft, dull thud. Eleanor stared at her, her expression hardening slightly as the relief was replaced by a vague, defensive irritation. Clara's complete lack of emotion, her refusal to cry, to scream, or to play the role of the hurt child, left Eleanor with nothing to fight against. She couldn't comfort her, and she couldn't dismiss her as being dramatic. "Well, if you're sure," Eleanor said, her voice dropping its warm, breathy pitch and returning to its dry, practical register. "I mean, if you really don't mind. Julian always said his graduation was incredibly boring, just hours of sitting in the sun listening to names being read. He said he wished he'd skipped the ceremony entirely." "I don't mind," Clara said. "All right," Eleanor said, already turning back toward the door, her phone back in her hand as she tapped out a message. "Well, we'll make sure to do a nice dinner for you when things quiet down. Maybe next weekend. We can order from that nice bistro you like." "That sounds fine," Clara said, knowing with absolute certainty that the dinner would never happen. Next weekend was Julian's welcome barbecue, and the weekend after that was Maya's end-of-season banquet. "I'll let your father know," Eleanor said, her voice already distant as she stepped out of the room. "Don't forget to put those library books away, Clara. The kitchen is still a mess." The door didn't slam this time. It swung closed with a soft, quiet click, leaving Clara in the gray afternoon light. She stood up from her desk. She walked over to the closet, opened the door, and looked at the black polyester gown hanging in the shadows. She reached out, her fingers brushing the stiff, synthetic fabric. It was cold to the touch. She felt no tears. She felt no anger. She only felt the quiet, immense power of a clean slate. She was officially on her own, and for the first time in her life, that felt like a victory. The Monday morning air was sharp and damp, smelling of wet asphalt and cut grass. At 6:15 a.m., the sun was a pale, flat disk struggling to rise above the neat rows of two-story suburban homes. Clara stood in her bedroom, pulling a thick black knit sweater over her shoulders. She zipped up her backpack, the heavy metal teeth of the zipper biting together with a clean, decisive snap. Inside were her study guides, her notes on research methodology, and 3 sharpened wooden pencils. She carried her shoes down the stairs, her bare feet pressing into the cold wood of each step to avoid making a sound. The kitchen was cold. The air conditioning had run all night, and the house felt sterile, like an empty hotel lobby. Usually on a Monday morning, Clara's routine was a frantic race against the clock. She would start the large coffee pot, set out the bread and toaster, make sure Maya's gym bag was by the door, and write a quick, neat grocery list on the white magnetic board. Today, Clara walked past the coffee maker. It sat dark and empty, the glass carafe showing a dusty gray reflection of the dim kitchen. She didn't touch it. She filled a travel mug with tap water, popped a single tea bag into it, and walked toward the garage door. "Clara," she stopped, her hand hovering an inch from the brass doorknob. Her father was standing at the end of the hallway, just outside the door to his home office. He was already wearing his crisp blue dress shirt and charcoal trousers, though his tie was draped untied around his collar. He held a leather portfolio under one arm and a stack of printed financial reports in the other. He was using the glass face of the old grandfather clock in the hall as a mirror, trying to adjust his collar. He didn't turn to look at her. His focus remained on his own reflection. "You're out early," Richard said, his voice flat, carrying the gravelly weight of a man who had already been reading spreadsheets for 2 hours. "Finals week starts today," Clara said. "Right," he grunted, adjusting his collar with a sharp, impatient tug. "Listen, your mother says you're going to the campus library today. When you're done, make sure you gas up the sedan. Maya has to drive it to her late practice this afternoon because your mother is taking the SUV to the booster meeting." Clara stood by the door, her fingers resting lightly on the cold brass of the knob. The sedan was a 10-year-old gray Honda. It wasn't a family car. Clara had bought it herself 2 years ago, using the $3,000 she had saved from her summer library shifts and a small academic stipend. The title, which sat in the accordion folder under her bed, bore only one name: Clara Vance. Yet, to her family, the car was simply another utility, an asset to be drafted into the family logistics whenever their own calendars overlapped. They never paid for its oil changes, they never offered to split the insurance, and they certainly never asked for permission before taking the keys off the hook. "The tank is almost empty," Clara said. "That's why I'm telling you to gas it up," Richard said, his tone dropping into the slightly patronizing register he used when he felt he was repeating himself. He finally turned his head, his eyes scanning her face for a brief, impatient second. "Just put a full tank in. I don't want Maya getting stuck on the highway after dark." He didn't reach for his leather wallet. He didn't offer a $20 bill. He simply assumed, as he always did, that the cost of Maya's convenience would be absorbed by Clara's bank account. Clara did a quick calculation. Her checking account stood at $62.14. A full tank of regular unleaded would cost exactly $38. If she paid for it, she would be left with $24 to survive the next 10 days until her move. If she refused, her father would lecture her about family responsibility and looking out for her sister, a speech she had heard so many times she could recite it from memory. "I'll put some in," Clara said. She didn't say how much. "Good, don't forget," Richard said, turning back to the grandfather clock to finally tie his tie. "And tell your mother if she calls that I'm skipping lunch. I have the quarterly review at noon." Clara opened the door to the garage and stepped through, the heavy wood door clicking shut behind her. The cool, concrete-scented air of the garage swallowed her. She got into her car. The engine started with its usual raspy rattle, the dashboard lights flickering before settling into a steady amber glow. She looked at the fuel gauge. The orange, low fuel light was a small, round eye staring back at her from the dark dashboard. She backed out of the garage, the tires crunching softly on the wet driveway. 2 miles down the road, she pulled into the bright, neon-lit canopy of a cheap gas station. The air smelled of exhaust and damp gravel. Clara stepped out of the car, her fingers numbed by the morning chill as she swiped her debit card at the pump. She selected regular unleaded, lifted the nozzle, and inserted it into her car's tank. She watched the digital numbers on the pump screen roll upward. 1.00, 2.00, 3.00. At exactly $5, Clara squeezed the metal trigger, stopping the flow of fuel. The pump gave a sharp metallic click. She hung the nozzle back on the rack, took her receipt, and got back into her car. The fuel gauge rose only a fraction of an inch, the orange, low fuel light extinguishing, but the needle still hovering dangerously close to the red line. It was exactly enough gas to get her to campus, let her sit in the library for 8 hours, and get her back to the house. It was not enough gas to get Maya to her late track practice. Clara put her seatbelt on, shifted the car into drive, and pulled out onto the highway. As she drove, she felt a quiet, hard knot of resolve tighten in her chest. She wasn't angry. She was simply playing by the rules they had established years ago. Everyone for themselves. She was just the last one to start playing. The quiet of the university library's 4th floor was absolute, broken only by the occasional dry rustle of turning pages and the distant, muffled chime of the campus clock tower striking 4 p.m. Clara sat at a secluded wooden study carrel tucked deep into the psychology stacks. A single fluorescent lamp cast a sharp cone of yellow light over her open textbook, her empty ceramic tea mug, and her phone, which had been silent and face down on the dark wood for the last 4 hours. Her temple throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache, the lingering aftermath of a grueling 2-hour research methods exam. She had written until her fingers were stiff, her wrist aching from the repetitive pressure of the pencil. But as she closed her exam booklet and handed it to the professor, she had felt a quiet, cold certainty. She had aced it. Now she reached out and turned her phone over. The screen lit up immediately, a bright, aggressive grid of notifications that shattered the dim peace of the study carrel. Maya, 2:45 p.m. Clara, the car is on E. Dad said you gassed it up. I'm literally stuck at the intersection near the school. Maya, 2:48 p.m. Seriously, where are you? Mom had to leave the meeting to get me. I'm going to be late for warm-ups. Eleanor, 3:02 p.m. Clara, why didn't you fill the tank? Your father specifically told you to gas up the sedan this morning. Maya is in tears, and I've had to drive 40 minutes back to find her. Answer your phone. Eleanor, 3:15 p.m. This is incredibly irresponsible of you. You knew how important today's practice was for your sister. Clara stared at the messages. She felt no panic. Her heart didn't beat faster, and she didn't feel the familiar, sickening rush of guilt that used to dominate her chest whenever she let the family down. She simply looked at the text previews as if they were data points on a graph, a predictable outcome of a system that was slowly, inevitably breaking down. She tapped out a reply. Her thumbs were slow, steady, and precise. Clara, 4:02 p.m. I told Dad I would put some in. I put in $5. That was all the cash I had on my card. She pressed send. The message slipped away with a soft, electronic chirp. Within 10 seconds, her phone began to vibrate, her mother's name flashing across the screen. Clara didn't answer it. She watched the phone slide a fraction of an inch across the polished wood of the desk with each vibration, buzzing like an angry insect until the call went to voicemail. She didn't listen to the voicemail. She swiped it away. Instead, she opened her mobile banking app. She logged in, her eyes focusing on the small gray numbers at the top of the screen. Available balance, $57.14. Beside her textbook lay her official move-in packet for the studio apartment downtown. On the first page, highlighted in yellow, was her internship schedule. Her first orientation day was May 15th, the day after her graduation. Her monthly stipend of $1,200 would be direct deposited on the 20th of every month. She pulled over her legal pad and began a new calculation. Between her graduation on Friday, May 14th, and her first stipend payment on May 20th, there were exactly 6 days. She would have to survive on $57.14. She divided the number by 6, $9.52 per day. She could buy a 5-pound bag of white rice for $3, a carton of 18 eggs for $4, and a jar of peanut butter for $3. That was $10 total. She would have $47 left for the commute, parking, and any unexpected fees. She wouldn't be able to afford coffee. She wouldn't be able to buy lunch. But she would eat, she would sleep, and she would have a roof over her head that her parents' names were not attached to. The math was clean, it was logical, and it was entirely possible. Clara closed her legal pad, sliding it into her backpack. She stood up, her joints popping softly after hours of sitting. She picked up her empty tea mug and her heavy textbook, carrying them toward the main desk. At the front desk, Mrs. Gable's sister, Sarah, was sorting returned books. She looked up, her face softening into a warm, genuine smile. "Finished for the day, Clara?" she asked. "Yes," Clara said, handing her the small brass key to her study carrel. "This is the last time I'll need it." Sarah took the key, her eyes reflecting a quiet, maternal pride. "Well, look at you, all done. You must be so excited for Friday. Are you doing anything special tonight to celebrate finishing your last exam?" "Just packing," Clara said softly. "Well, make sure you get some rest," Sarah said, tapping the key against her palm. "You've worked harder than almost any student I've seen in this library, Clara. You deserve every bit of your success." "Thank you, Sarah," Clara said. She slung her backpack over her shoulder and walked out of the library, her sneakers squeaking quietly on the polished marble of the lobby. Outside, the late afternoon sun was beginning to dip below the campus oaks, casting long, dramatic shadows across the grass. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth. Clara walked toward her car, her hand reaching into her pocket to feel the cold, reassuring shape of her key. Her phone buzzed again, a single text from her father. "Richard, we will talk about this car situation when you get home." Clara didn't reply. She unlocked her car door, climbed into the driver's seat, and set her backpack on the passenger side. She turned the key, and the engine started with its familiar, raspy growl. She looked at the fuel gauge. The low fuel light was back on, a bright orange dot in the dim cabin. She had exactly enough gas to get back to the house, pack the rest of her things, and make it to the apartment on Friday. She shifted the car into drive, and pulled out of the campus lot, leaving the quiet university behind. The Cold War was over. The logistics of her departure were already in motion. The sun had slipped below the horizon, leaving the sky a bruised, dark violet when Clara pulled into the driveway. She turned off the ignition and sat in the dark of her sedan. The garage door was closed, indicating her father's car and her mother's SUV were already parked inside. The house was brightly lit, golden light spilling from the kitchen windows onto the neatly manicured lawn, casting long, fractured shadows across the driveway. Clara unbuckled her seatbelt. She reached into her pocket and felt her car key, its metal cold and sharp against her thumb. She had a second key, a spare she had made 2 years ago, and kept taped to the underside of her desk drawer. She left her backpack on the passenger seat, taking only her phone, and pushed open the car door. The air outside was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and the neighbor's wood smoke. When Clara pushed open the heavy wooden door of the utility room, she was greeted by the sharp, acidic smell of vinegar-based salad dressing and the rhythmic, aggressive thunk, thunk, thunk of her father slicing grilled chicken on a wooden cutting board in the kitchen. As she stepped into the kitchen, the noise stopped. Richard stood at the island, a heavy chef's knife in his hand. He looked up, his face set in a hard, disapproving mask. Eleanor was sitting at the dining table, her laptop open, but her eyes were already locked on Clara. Maya sat next to her, her arms crossed, her track jacket still zipped up to her chin, her face carrying a sullen, victorious pout. The silence was thick, heavy with the weight of an impending lecture. "Where have you been, Clara?" Richard asked, his voice low and carrying the gravelly authority of a man who spent his days managing corporate divisions. He set the knife down on the board with a sharp, heavy clack. "At the library," Clara said. "We've been waiting for you for an hour," Eleanor said, her voice rising in a tight, breathy pitch of grievance. "Do you have any idea what kind of chaos you caused today? Maya was stranded at the intersection. Her phone died. I had to leave my client lunch, drive 40 minutes, and jump her car because she ran completely out of gas. It was incredibly dangerous." "I put $5 of gas in," Clara said, her voice quiet and even. "I told you to fill the tank, Clara," Richard said, stepping around the island. He wiped his hands on a kitchen towel, his eyes narrowing. "I told you this morning. Maya needed the car for her late practice. You deliberately ignored a direct instruction." "I didn't ignore it," Clara said. She looked directly at her father, her gaze steady and unbroken. "I had $62 in my account. After I paid $5 for gas, I had $57. A full tank would have cost $38. I couldn't afford it." Richard's jaw tightened. He looked briefly at Eleanor, then back at Clara, his expression shifting from anger to a defensive, uncomfortable irritation. He hated being reminded of Clara's financial reality, mostly because it disrupted his belief that he was a generous, providing patriarch. "You should have told me," Richard muttered, his tone dropping into a patronizing growl. "You should have asked for my card. You don't just leave your sister stranded on the side of the road because of a few dollars." "I did tell you," Clara said. Her voice remained flat, devoid of any anger or tears. "I told you on Saturday that I didn't have enough cash on my card. You told me to just handle it and that you'd settle up later. I couldn't handle it today." Silence fell over the kitchen. Maya shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her eyes darting to her phone. Eleanor looked away, her fingers tapping a nervous rhythm on her laptop keyboard. Richard's face flushed a dull, dark red. He didn't have a logical response to the raw, mechanical reality of a declined bank account. He couldn't argue with the numbers, so he did what he always did when his authority was challenged. He shifted the rules to regain control. "Well, this car situation isn't working," Richard said, his voice hardening as he folded his arms across his chest. "You're clearly not responsible enough to manage the vehicle if you can't keep it fueled. From now on, the keys to the sedan stay on the kitchen island. If you need to use the car, you ask your mother or me. Maya needs it for the rest of the week for track anyway." Clara looked at the white marble counter. The sedan was hers. She had bought it. The title was in her name. If she took her folder down right now, if she showed them the paperwork and pointed out that they had no legal right to confiscate her keys, it would trigger a massive, screaming blowout. Eleanor would cry. Richard would shout about the roof over her head, the food she ate, and the college tuition they claimed to have helped with, even though her student loans and work study had covered nearly 90% of it. An argument would cost energy she didn't have. It would disrupt her final preparations. And more than that, she didn't need to argue. She had a spare key, her lease was signed, her bags were almost packed. In 4 days she would be gone, and they would never have to worry about her car, her schedule, or her bank account ever again. She reached into her pocket, her fingers wrapped around her keyring. She pulled the keys out and placed them on the cool marble of the island. They fell with a light, metallic jingle that sounded surprisingly loud in the quiet kitchen. "Okay," Clara said softly. Richard blinked, clearly taken aback by her immediate, quiet compliance. He had expected a fight. He had prepared his counter-arguments, his lectures about gratitude and family duty. To have her simply hand over the keys without a single tear or protest left him standing in a vacuum, his anger suddenly hollow and useless. "Go wash up," Richard muttered, turning back to the cutting board. "Dinner is almost ready." "I'm not hungry," Clara said. "I have to study." She turned and walked out of the kitchen. As her foot hit the bottom step of the stairs, she heard her mother let out a soft, exasperated sigh. "I don't know what's wrong with her lately," Eleanor whispered, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet hallway. "She's being so cold. It's like she's trying to punish us for something." Clara climbed the stairs, her steps light and rhythmic. She didn't feel cold. She felt remarkably warm, a quiet, steady flame of anticipation burning in her chest. She had handed over her keys, but she had kept her freedom, and they wouldn't realize the difference until her room was entirely empty. The house was empty on Tuesday morning, filled only with the rhythmic, low-frequency hum of the central heating unit and the occasional creak of the rafters settling in the spring heat. Richard had left for his corporate office at 7. Eleanor had departed shortly after to run errands for Maya's booster club, her SUV tires crunching loudly over the gravel before fading into the morning traffic. Maya was at school, insulated from the domestic chill by her classes and her track team. Clara stood in the center of her bedroom. The sunlight streamed through her window, throwing bright golden rectangles across her carpet, illuminating the fine layer of dust that had gathered on her dresser. It was time to pack. She didn't have cardboard boxes. Boxes in her room would be too obvious, a physical announcement of her departure that would invite premature questions and emotional friction. Instead, she had retrieved 2 large dark green canvas duffel bags she had bought at an army surplus store during her freshman year. They sat open on her mattress, like 2 dark gaping mouths. Clara began her routine of physical economy. She opened her dresser drawers, pulling out her clothes and folding them using a tight military roll she had learned from a library archiving manual. Each t-shirt, each pair of jeans, each sweater was rolled into a dense, firm cylinder, minimizing the space it occupied. She packed them into the duffel bags methodically, placing the heaviest items at the bottom and the lighter ones on top. As she worked, her fingers brushed against a small, silver-framed photograph on her nightstand. She picked it up, her thumb wiping a thin layer of dust from the glass. It was a family photo from their vacation to the Outer Banks 5 years ago. Richard, Eleanor, Julian, and Maya were standing in the surf, their arms linked, their faces bright and sunburned as they laughed at the camera. Clara was in the photo too, but she was standing several feet to the left, holding the beach umbrella and 2 canvas tote bags filled with their towels. The shadow of the umbrella fell directly across her face, obscuring her features, leaving her a dark, anonymous silhouette beside their bright, colorful group. She had been the one who took the dry towels down to them when they were cold. She had been the one who carried the heavy cooler back up the dunes. Clara looked at the photo for a long, quiet moment. The silver frame was heavy, cold in her palm. It was a physical ledger of her role in the family, the silent, invisible support structure that held their memories together while remaining entirely outside of them. She didn't pack the photo. She set it face down on the wooden nightstand, the dark velvet backing of the frame facing the ceiling. She went downstairs to the kitchen to get a glass of tap water. The house felt vast and hollow when it was empty, like a museum after hours. On the kitchen island, sitting next to the empty coffee maker, was a stack of mail that had been brought in yesterday. On top of the pile was a large white window envelope addressed to Clara Vance. It was her official graduation packet from the university registry, containing her parking pass for the stadium and her 2 guest tickets. The envelope had already been opened. The top edge was torn jaggedly, as if someone had sliced it open with a finger in a hurry. Clara picked it up. She pulled out the contents. The 2 guest tickets, bright blue cardstock with gold embossed lettering, fell onto the marble counter. Her mother had obviously opened it, likely looking for a bill or simply acting on the deeply ingrained habit of treating Clara's mail as public property. Eleanor had seen the tickets. She had seen the date, the time, and the seat assignments. And then she had simply put them back in the envelope, stacked them with the grocery coupons, and left them on the counter without saying a word. She hadn't mentioned them. She hadn't left a note. Clara took the 2 guest tickets. They were stiff, the gold lettering slightly raised under her fingertips. She did a quick mental calculation. She could leave the tickets on the counter. She could wait to see if anyone asked about them, if anyone expressed a sudden, guilt-driven desire to take them. But she already knew the math of that equation. If she left them, they would sit there until Friday morning, when they would be swept into the trash bin along with the weekly circulars, completely unnoticed. She folded the blue tickets in half, the thick cardstock resisting the crease with a soft, stubborn snap. She slipped them into her pocket. She walked back up the stairs, carrying her glass of water. In her bedroom, she resumed her packing. She packed her books, her winter coats, her spare shoes, and the small wooden box that held her childhood journals. Everything she owned, everything she had built or kept over the last 22 years, fit perfectly into the 2 canvas duffel bags and her school backpack. She zipped the first duffel bag shut. The heavy brass teeth clicked together, a solid, final sound that seemed to echo in the quiet room. She dragged the bag off the bed and slid it deep into her closet, hiding it behind her hanging winter coats. She did the same with the second bag. Unless someone walked into her closet and actively parted her clothes, her room looked exactly as it had that morning, tidy, quiet, and occupied. She sat down at her desk, her hand reaching into her pocket to pull out the folded blue guest tickets. She laid them flat on her desk, smoothing the crease with her thumb. They were empty seats. They would remain empty. And for the first time, the thought of those empty chairs didn't make her chest ache. It felt clean, It felt like space. The sharp, bitter scent of burnt garlic drifted up the stairs, followed by the clatter of a heavy metal pan hitting the kitchen sink with a loud, hollow clang. Clara stood on the dimly lit second-floor landing, her hand resting lightly on the wooden railing. Below her, the house was a theater of disorganized noise. It was 7:30 p.m. on Tuesday, and for the first time in months, Clara had simply stayed in her room, ignoring the unspoken expectation that she would manage the dinner hour. "I didn't burn it on purpose, Maya." Eleanor's voice rose from the kitchen, tight and frayed with high-register frustration. "I was trying to answer a text from your coach. If your father would help, maybe we wouldn't be eating charred chicken." "I was setting up my computer for the regional call, Eleanor." Richard's voice rumbled from the den, dry and defensive. "And where is Clara? Isn't she supposed to be helping with this?" "She's still upstairs," Eleanor said, followed by the sharp metallic scrape of a spatula against a pan. "She's been in her room all afternoon, studying. I asked her to look for Maya's athletic permission slip earlier, and she just told me she didn't know where it was. She didn't even look." "She's being incredibly petulant," Richard grumbled, his heavy footsteps moving toward the kitchen. "This is a childish temper tantrum because I took her keys. If she wants to sit up there and pelt like a teenager, let her. But she's not getting those keys back until she learns some basic respect for this family." Clara stood perfectly still in the shadows of the landing. Her face remained blank, her heart beating in a slow, steady rhythm. She listened to their irritation, but it felt distant now, like static on a radio station she was slowly tuning out. They believed her silence was a tantrum, a temporary protest designed to elicit an apology or get her car keys back. They were treating her withdrawal as a resource shortage, a temporary drought they just had to wait out. They didn't realize the tap was dry because she had cut the pipe. She turned and walked back to her room, her bare feet silent on the carpet. She closed her bedroom door and sat down at her desk. Her laptop screen cast a cool blue light over her face, illuminating the university registrar's portal. She was completing her final graduation exit checklist. With a series of precise, quiet clicks of her mouse, she began the digital extraction of her life. First, she opened her student account settings. She navigated to the emergency contact and mailing address fields. She deleted her parents' home address, the neat suburban street name she had lived on for 18 years, and typed in her new address, apartment 3C, 412 North Elm Street. Next, she looked at the university alumni directory. She checked the box that read, "Do not share contact information with family members." Finally, she opened her bank account settings. She unlinked her savings account from the joint parental overdraft protection plan her father had set up when she was 17, a feature he had occasionally used as an excuse to monitor her minor transactions. From this moment on, her $57.14 belonged to her alone, entirely invisible to his corporate banking app. She clicked Confirm. The screen flickered, a small green checkmark appearing next to her graduation profile. "Your graduation registration is complete. Commencement, Friday, May 14th, 10 a.m. Clara closed her laptop. The screen went dark, and the room returned to the soft gray shadows of the evening. She did a quick calculation. Today was Tuesday. She had exactly 2 full days left in this house. Maya's regional track finals were on Friday morning, which meant the entire family, Richard, Eleanor, and Maya, would be leaving the house by 7:30 a.m. on Friday to make the 40-mile drive north to the stadium. They would be gone all day, likely not returning until late Friday evening after the celebratory team dinner. If she waited until Friday morning to pack her car, they might catch her. There would be questions, demands, and a frantic, dramatic scene that would ruin her morning. But on Thursday night, the family was hosting the pre-tournament booster pasta dinner at the high school cafeteria. They would all be out of the house from 5 p.m. until at least 9 p.m. She had a 4-hour window on Thursday night. She would use her spare key to unlock her sedan, load her 2 canvas duffel bags, her backpack, and her cardboard cap and gown box into the trunk, and park the car 2 blocks down the street, hidden under the canopy of the neighborhood park. On Friday morning, she would simply walk out of the front door with her purse, get into her car, and drive to the university. By the time they returned from Maya's track meet on Friday night, her room would be empty. Clara leaned back in her chair, her hands resting flat on the cool wood of her desk. Through the floorboards, she could hear the muffled, angry scrape of a dining chair being dragged across the kitchen tile, followed by Maya's whiny voice complaining about the burnt chicken. The household was sliding into its usual chaotic friction, but Clara felt entirely weightless. She was a ghost in their ledger, a name on a calendar they had already painted over. In 48 hours, the empty space she left behind would be absolute, and there would be no keys left for them to take. The microwave timer ticked down in silent, glowing green increments: 005, 004, 003. Clara stood in the gray morning light of the kitchen, her eyes fixed on the small paper cup of instant oatmeal rotating slowly under the yellow bulb inside the machine. The kitchen was cold, the air conditioning hum whistling softly through the vents. Behind her, sitting exactly where she had left them, on the corner of the white marble island, were her car keys. The silver key ring caught the morning glare, cold and metallic, positioned like a tiny monument to her father's authority. The microwave beeped, a sharp, sterile sound that cut through the quiet. Clara opened the door, the sweet chemical smell of artificial maple and brown sugar rising in a hot burst of steam. She grabbed the hot paper cup with her fingertips, her movements slow and deliberate, and carried it to the counter. The kitchen door swung open, and Eleanor hurried in. She was already dressed in a sharp beige pantsuit, her phone pressed to her ear with her shoulder while she struggled to zip up her leather purse. "No, I understand, Brenda, but the booster banners have to be printed by Thursday night," Eleanor said into the phone, her voice tight with her usual morning anxiety. "If the colors are off, Maya is going to be devastated. Just check with the printer again." She dropped her purse onto the stool next to the island, hung up the call, and let out a long, theatrical sigh. She immediately reached for the coffee maker, pouring the lukewarm dregs of Richard's morning brew into her travel mug. Only then did she look at Clara. Her eyes drifted down to the keys on the island, then up to Clara's face. There was a tense, expectant pause. For the last 24 hours, the family had been waiting for Clara to break. They had assumed she would wake up this morning, realize the sheer inconvenience of being without a car during finals week, and ask for her keys back. They expected the standard sequence: a quiet apology, a promise to be more cooperative, and a return to the comfortable, invisible labor that kept the household running. "Clara, sweetie," Eleanor said, her voice adopting a soft, transactional warmth. "Maya has to stay after school today for the pre-tournament team briefing. She doesn't need the sedan until later." She picked up the key ring, the silver keys jingling softly in her palm. She held them out toward Clara, her expression carrying the polite, dismissive benevolence of a manager offering a reward. "If you need to go to campus to study, you can take the car," Eleanor said. "But you'll need to pick Maya up at 5 o'clock sharp. And on the way back, stop by the dry cleaners again to make sure they got the starch right on her backup track jersey." Clara looked at the keys dangling from her mother's fingers. It was a classic calculation of family leverage. They weren't giving her the car back out of kindness or a sudden realization that the vehicle belonged to her. They were offering her access to her own property in exchange for a 3-hour chore commitment. They viewed her mobility as a resource they could meter out, a tap they could turn on only when they needed their own glasses filled. "I don't need the car today," Clara said. Eleanor's hand remained suspended in the air, the keys perfectly still. Her smile faltered, her eyebrows knitting together in genuine, irritated confusion. "What do you mean you don't need it? Don't you have your final library shift today? You can't walk all the way to campus, Clara. It's 6 miles. "I'm taking the bus," Clara said. "The bus?" Eleanor repeated the word as if Clara had suggested riding a pack mule. "Clara, don't be ridiculous. The bus takes over an hour. It stops at every single block. You'll waste half your morning just sitting in transit." "I have my book," Clara said, her voice flat and remarkably calm. "I don't mind the ride." "But what about Maya?" Eleanor's tone sharpened, the transactional warmth vanishing instantly, replaced by the hard, defensive edge of someone whose schedule had just been disrupted. "If you don't take the car, I'm going to have to cancel my 3 o'clock staging consultation to drive all the way back down here and pick her up. It's completely inconvenient." "You can take her SUV," Clara said, her expression perfectly blank. "Or Dad can pick her up on his way back from the office." "Your father has a board dinner tonight, Clara," Eleanor said, her voice rising in pitch. She tossed the keys back onto the marble island, where they hit the stone with a harsh, clattering jingle. "Honestly, I don't know what has gotten into you. You are being deliberately obstinate. You'd rather sit on a dirty public bus for 2 hours than do a simple favor for your sister?" "I'm just planning my day," Clara said softly. She picked up her paper cup of oatmeal and her metal spoon. She didn't look at her mother's furious, red-faced expression. She walked out of the kitchen, her steps light and unhurried as she headed toward the hallway. Behind her, she heard the sharp, angry rustle of Eleanor snatching her purse off the stool, followed by the furious tapping of her fingernails against her phone screen as she texted Richard. Clara walked out of the front door and onto the quiet, tree-lined street. The morning air was cool, carrying the scent of damp pavement and blooming azaleas. She walked 2 blocks to the concrete bus stop shelter at the corner of the avenue. She sat down on the cold metal bench, her backpack resting on her lap, and pulled her bus pass from her pocket. The bus ride to campus took exactly 84 minutes. As Clara sat by the window, watching the neat suburban lawns give way to the bustling, brick-lined streets of the university district, she felt a profound, quiet peace. It was true that the bus was slow. It was true that it smelled of wet umbrellas and vinyl seats, but for those 84 minutes, no one could ask her to pick up dry cleaning. No one could demand she buy cinnamon rolls. No one could treat her time as a natural resource to be harvested for their convenience. She looked down at her book, the pages turning in a steady, quiet rhythm as the bus rolled forward. The 84 minutes weren't wasted. They were hers. The plastic lanyard of Clara's library identification card clicked softly as she laid it on her desk. She had turned in her keys, cleared out her small metal locker in the staff break room, and signed her final timesheet. Her employment at the university was officially over. She had taken the bus back, the slow, rumbling route dropping her off at the corner of her neighborhood just as the streetlights began to flicker to life. When she walked through the garage door, the house was quiet, but it was the tense, loaded quiet of an active workspace. She walked into the utility corridor, intending to head straight to her room, but stopped at the entrance of the laundry room. Her graduation gown, the one she had carefully hidden in the dark back corner of her closet behind her heavy winter coats, was hanging from the overhead pipe. The protective clear plastic shroud she had kept it in had been ripped open, left in a crumpled heap on the dryer. The gown itself, made of cheap, stiff black polyester, was draped over a plastic hanger. It was being used as a makeshift dust cover, pinned over Julian's charcoal wool suit to protect the shoulders from lint. The hem of Clara's gown was dragging on the linoleum floor, directly touching the edge of a plastic basket overflowing with Maya's muddy, clay-stained track socks. Clara stood in the doorway, her backpack still resting heavy on her shoulders. Her face was completely still, her eyes fixed on the black fabric resting against the dirt. "Oh, Clara, you're back!" Eleanor stepped out of the adjacent pantry, carrying a large cardboard box of protein bars for Maya's team. She set the box on the washing machine, her eyes darting briefly to Clara, then to the black gown, before she smoothed her apron with her hands. "I went into your closet this afternoon to find that old blue duffel bag Julian left behind," Eleanor said, her voice carrying a light defensive speed. "I saw that black robe hanging in the back. Julian needed something to cover his wool suit. He's driving with the windows down because the SUV's air conditioning is acting up again, and you know how easily that charcoal fabric attracts dust." "You took it out of the plastic," Clara said. Her voice was very quiet, almost a whisper, but it had a cold, clear edge that made Eleanor pause. "Well, yes, I had to," Eleanor said, her tone instantly shifting into a slightly defensive, patronizing register. "The plastic was too tight to fit over his suit shoulders. Honestly, Clara, don't look at me like that. It's just a cheap piece of synthetic fabric. It's not like it's a wedding dress." Clara walked into the laundry room. She reached out, her fingers touching the hem of her gown. She lifted it slightly. The bottom 3 inches of the black polyester were smudged with dry orange clay from Maya's track socks. A faint, oily smell of fabric softener and stale detergent clung to the fabric, replacing the clean, sterile scent of the new garment. "We can just shake the dust off before Friday," Eleanor said, waving her hand dismissively as she picked up her box of protein bars. "Or run a damp cloth over it. It's black. Nobody is going to see a little smudge from the stage anyway. And besides, you said yourself you didn't mind going alone. It's not like we're going to be taking formal family photos." She stepped past Clara, her shoulder brushing against the hanging black sleeve, completely indifferent to the physical reality of what she had done. "Make sure you move Julian's suit back to his room when you're done," Eleanor called out as she walked toward the kitchen. "He doesn't want it getting wrinkled in here with the dryer heat." Clara stood alone in the laundry room. The dryer hummed, a low, warm vibration that filled the narrow space with the scent of cheap lavender. She looked at the orange clay smudge on the hem of her gown. She did a quick calculation. She could wash it. She could spend her Wednesday evening scrubbing the polyester on her hands and knees in the utility sink, trying to get the orange clay out before the fabric stained permanently. She could cry. She could walk into the kitchen, confront her mother, and demand to know why Julian's wool suit was more important than the physical proof of her 4 years of hard work. But she already knew the answer to that question. It was the same answer she had been given her entire life, written in the margins of their calendars, the empty seats at her dinners, and the yellow sticky notes that covered her name. She reached up, her fingers wrapping around the plastic hanger of her gown. With a single smooth motion, she slid the gown off Julian's suit. The charcoal wool was left bare, exposed to the dusty air of the utility room. Clara let the hanger rest in her hand, the black fabric draping down her side, the dirty hem dragging lightly across her sneakers as she walked. She didn't move Julian's suit back to his room. She left it hanging from the overhead pipe, unprotected and bare. She walked out of the laundry room, carrying her stained gown up the stairs. She didn't look back, and she didn't make a sound. In the quiet of her bedroom, she hung the gown on the back of her door. She didn't try to clean the clay smudge. She left it exactly as it was, a physical record of the final line they had crossed, a mark she would wear on Friday like a badge of honor. The deep, vibrating rumble of her father's SUV starting up in the driveway rattled the windowpane of Clara's bedroom. It was Thursday afternoon, exactly 4:50 p.m. Clara stood by her window, her fingers wrapped around the small, cold shape of her spare car key inside her pocket. Down below, the SUV's exhaust sent a pale plume of white vapor into the cooling afternoon air. Maya sat in the front passenger seat, her head tilted back as she laughed at something on her phone, while Eleanor adjusted the rearview mirror, her lips moving in a rapid, silent stream of instructions. Richard sat at the wheel, his gaze fixed straight ahead, eager to get the drive over with. They were heading to the high school booster club's pre-tournament pasta dinner. It was the biggest social event of the track season, a 4-hour marathon of speeches, carbohydrate loading, and parent-athlete photos. A minute earlier, Eleanor's voice had drifted up the stairs, carrying the flat, perfunctory tone of a chore list. "Clara, we're leaving for the dinner. There are some leftover wraps in the fridge if you get hungry. Make sure the back patio door is locked before dark." They hadn't asked her to join them. They hadn't even gone through the polite motion of a reluctant invitation. To them, Clara's silence was still a childish, sulking phase, a passive-aggressive mood they intended to ignore until she decided to behave like a team player again. They were comfortable leaving her behind, insulated by the convenient belief that she just wanted to study. The SUV backed out of the driveway, the tires crunching softly on the gravel before turning onto the main road. The sound of the engine slowly faded, swallowed by the quiet of the suburban street. Then the house settled into an absolute, hollow silence. Clara waited exactly 10 minutes. She stood by the window, watching the empty driveway, her mind running through the precise timeline she had constructed. At 5 p.m., she turned away from the window. She walked to her closet, pushed aside the empty wooden hangers that clicked together with a light, hollow clack-clack, and dragged her 2 heavy green canvas duffel bags out into the center of her bedroom. She slung her backpack over her right shoulder. Under her left arm, she tucked the large cardboard box containing her graduation cap and her stained black gown. She carried the load down the stairs. Her steps were slow, heavy, and rhythmic. The stairs did not creak. She bypassed the kitchen entirely. She didn't look at the empty coffee maker, the dirty glasses in the sink, or the keys to her sedan that still sat exactly where she had left them on the marble island. She unlocked the utility room door and stepped out into the cool, concrete-scented darkness of the garage. Her gray sedan sat in its designated bay, cold and silent. Clara walked to the rear of the car. She reached into her pocket, pulled out her spare key, and slid it into the trunk lock. The mechanism turned with a solid metallic click, and the heavy trunk lid popped upward. She carefully packed her life into the dark, carpeted space. She laid the 2 heavy canvas duffel bags side by side, their thick fabric fitting snugly between the wheel wells. She placed the cardboard box containing her graduation gown flat on top of the bags, ensuring the stained hem was tucked safely inside. She set her school backpack on the front passenger seat, next to the small plastic accordion folder holding her legal documents. The trunk closed with a heavy, muffled thud that echoed softly in the enclosed garage. Clara got into the driver's seat. She inserted her spare key into the ignition. The engine coughed twice, its familiar, raspy growl filling the garage, before settling into a low, vibrating idle. She kept her foot pressed firmly on the brake, ensuring the brake lights didn't flash against the closed garage door for too long. She pressed the automatic garage door opener on her visor. The heavy wooden door rolled upward, letting in a rush of cool evening air and the pale gray light of dusk. Clara backed her car out of the bay, rolling down the concrete driveway and onto the quiet street. She didn't drive toward the highway. She drove 2 blocks north, steering her sedan under the thick, drooping canopy of a massive weeping willow tree that bordered the neighborhood park. It was a dark, secluded spot, completely invisible from the main road and her parents' driveway. She turned off the engine. The dashboard lights died, the orange, low fuel light vanishing into the dark. She locked the car doors, pulled her spare key from the ignition, and stepped out onto the damp grass. She walked the 2 blocks back to her house, her hands buried deep in her jacket pockets, her head bowed against the cool evening breeze. When she stepped back inside through the garage, she locked the door behind her. She walked up the stairs and into her bedroom. The room was stark, stripped of everything that made it hers. The dresser drawers were pushed closed, completely empty. The closet door stood open, revealing a row of bare wooden hangers dangling from the metal rod like a line of skeletal rib cages. All that remained was her bare mattress, her wooden desk, and the quiet gray light of the evening fading on her empty walls. She sat down on the edge of the mattress, her hands resting flat on the bare fabric. She did a quick calculation. It was 5:25 p.m. Her parents and Maya would not be back from the booster dinner until at least 9:30 p.m. She had exactly 16 hours left under this roof. 16 hours before the morning sun would rise on Friday, the day of Maya's track finals and the day of her own graduation. The preparation was complete. Her bags were loaded. Her car was hidden. She had erased herself from their space, and they wouldn't even notice the empty hangars until she was already gone. The headlights of her father's SUV swept across the ceiling of Clara's bedroom, a pair of sharp white fingers of light, sliding slowly over the bare plaster before vanishing into the dark. It was 9:42 p.m. Clara lay perfectly still on her back, on top of her thin, bare mattress. She had left her sheets and pillow on the bed to maintain the illusion of an occupied room, but she lay fully clothed, her hands folded over her chest, her breathing slow, rhythmic, and shallow. Downstairs, the automatic garage door rumbled closed with its familiar heavy vibration. The front door opened, letting in a sudden burst of loud, energized voices that carried up the stairs like a physical wave. They were riding the high of the booster dinner, the speeches, the praise, the public validation that they lived for. "I'm telling you, Richard, the scout from state was specifically asking about Maya's block starts." Eleanor's voice carried clearly, her tone bright and breathless with vicarious triumph. "He said if she shaves even 1/10 of a second off her preliminary time tomorrow, she's basically guaranteed a spot." "She'll do it," Richard's heavy, confident baritone rumbled. "She's been training for this all spring. Maya, make sure you're in bed by 10:30. I don't want you sluggish in the morning." "I know, Dad," Maya said, her voice carrying a light, self-satisfied whine. "Can someone bring my water bottle up? I left it in the trunk." Clara listened to the auditory decay of their evening routine, the heavy thud of the refrigerator door closing, the clink of glasses, the sharp, hollow tap of Eleanor's heels on the hardwood hall floor as she headed toward the stairs. They were entirely self-absorbed, insulated by their own excitement. To them, the house was exactly as it had always been, a quiet background structure maintained by an invisible hand. They had no idea that the pantry shelves they were pulling snacks from, the counters they were wiping, and the laundry baskets they were ignoring were no longer Clara's responsibility. The footsteps moved up the stairs. Maya's bedroom door slammed shut, followed by the muffled, high-volume bass of her phone speaker. Eleanor's footsteps approached Clara's door, slowing down as they reached the landing. Clara closed her eyes. She focused on the metabolic restraint of absolute stillness, her chest rising and falling in a slow, imperceptible rhythm, simulating the deep, heavy breathing of sleep. The door to her room creaked open a fraction of an inch. A narrow sliver of yellow hallway light cut across the dark carpet, stopping just short of her empty desk. Clara didn't flinch. She kept her eyes shut, her face relaxed. "Clara?" Eleanor's voice was a soft, distracted whisper. She didn't step into the room. She didn't turn on the light. She stood in the threshold for less than 3 seconds, her hand resting on the brass doorknob. From her position at the door, she could see the silhouette of Clara's body on the bed, and that was enough. She didn't look at the desk, which was completely bare of books, pens, and paper. She didn't look at the open closet, where the empty hangers hung in silent, skeletal lines. To Eleanor, Clara's presence was a given, a default setting of the house that required no active investigation. "Sleep tight, sweetie," Eleanor murmured, her voice lacking any real depth of warmth. A perfunctory maternal duty ticked off a list. The door clicked shut, the sliver of yellow light vanishing, returning the room to the cool, gray shadows of the night. Eleanor's footsteps faded down the hallway toward the master bedroom, followed by the distant, heavy thud of her parents' door closing. Clara opened her eyes. She stared at the dark ceiling. Outside, a light, steady rain had begun to fall, the tiny drops pattering rhythmically against her window pane like a soft, whispering countdown. She did a quick calculation. It was 10:15 p.m. They would wake up at 6:30 a.m. They would spend 45 minutes running around the house, looking for Maya's lucky socks, screaming about the car keys, and packing the SUV before leaving the driveway by 7:15 a.m. She would wake up at 5:45 a.m. She would slip out of the house while the rooms were still dark and cold, walk the 2 blocks to her hidden car, and drive to the university. She would have a 90-minute head start. By the time they realized she wasn't in her bed, she would already be sitting in the student union, her cap and gown on, waiting for the commencement procession to begin. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing against the stiff, folded blue guest tickets. They were still there. She had no intention of using them, nor would she leave them behind for her parents to find. They would stay in her pocket, a silent, folded ledger of a family that had to be reminded of her existence, and who, when reminded, had chosen to look away. This was her final night in this room. She had slept in this bed since she was 4 years old, surrounded by the quiet accumulation of a childhood she had spent trying to be enough. But as she lay there in the dark, listening to the rain, she felt no nostalgia, she felt no regret. She only felt the clean, mathematical finality of a long, slow withdrawal. She was already gone. The house just hadn't caught up to her absence yet. At exactly 5:45 a.m., the alarm on Clara's watch vibrated against her wrist. 3 soft, rhythmic pulses of pressure that did not make a sound. Clara opened her eyes. The room was cold, filled with the faint blue-gray mist of dawn filtering through the wet glass of her window. The rain had stopped, leaving the world outside silent, wrapped in a thick, low-hanging suburban fog. She sat up slowly, her muscles stiff from sleeping fully clothed on the bare mattress. She began her final physical routine in this room. She turned back to the bed, grabbing the single, faded blue fleece blanket she had used to keep warm. She folded it with absolute precision, smoothing out the wrinkles with her palms until it was a neat, dense square. She placed it exactly in the center of the bare mattress. She stood by her desk, her eyes scanning the surface. There was nothing left, no stray paper clips, no pencil shavings, no dust rings where her textbooks had sat. The wood was completely clean, reflecting the dim gray light of the window like a sheet of ice. She picked up her purse, slipping the strap over her shoulder, and walked to her bedroom door. She turned the handle, the old metal clicking with a soft, hollow sound that seemed to linger in the quiet hallway. She stepped out onto the carpeted landing, pulling her door shut behind her. She didn't let the latch click. She held the handle down until the door was fully flush with the frame, then released it slowly, silently. The landing was cold. Clara walked down the hallway, her bare feet sinking into the carpet. She passed her parents' closed door first. From inside, she could hear the rhythmic, heavy sound of her father's soft snoring, a steady, low rumble that had been the background noise of her childhood mornings. It was a comfortable, undisturbed sound, the breathing of a man who slept with the absolute certainty that his world was secure. She passed Maya's room next. Through the wood, the soft, mechanical hum of Maya's white noise machine vibrated in a steady, ocean wave pattern, designed to block out the rest of the house so she could sleep deeply before her big race. They were all asleep. They were entirely contained within their own rooms, their own dreams, and their own schedules. Clara walked down the stairs. Each wooden step was familiar, a memory of where to place her weight to avoid the creaks. She reached the bottom landing and walked into the kitchen. The kitchen was gray and sterile, illuminated only by the faint light coming through the high window above the sink. On the marble kitchen island, sitting exactly where they had been left, were her primary car keys. They looked small in the vast empty space of the stone counter, their silver rings catching the faint dawn light. Clara stood by the island for 3 seconds. She looked at the keys. She didn't reach for them. She didn't touch them. She let them lie there on the cold stone, a useless trophy of a victory her father believed he had won, a set of keys to a car that was no longer in the driveway. She walked to the front foyer. Her sneakers were sitting by the door. She slipped them on, tying the laces with slow, tight knots. She reached out and grasped the heavy brass handle of the front door. The metal was freezing, biting into her palm through her skin. She turned the lock. The deadbolt slid back with a heavy metallic clack that sounded incredibly loud in the silent house. Clara paused, her heart beating in a slow, steady rhythm. She listened. Upstairs, the snoring continued. The white noise machine hummed. No doors opened. No one called her name. She pushed the door open. A rush of cold, damp morning air hit her face, carrying the scent of wet pine needles, wet asphalt, and the early morning fog. She stepped out onto the concrete porch, pulling the heavy wooden door shut behind her until the latch clicked into place. She was outside. Clara walked down the concrete steps, her head bowed against the morning chill. The street was entirely empty, the houses on either side dark and silent, their windows reflecting the pale gray sky. The fog hung thick over the lawns, swallowing the bases of the oak trees, making the neighborhood look like a watercolor painting that hadn't fully dried. She walked the 2 blocks north, her sneakers crunching softly on the wet pavement. When she reached the neighborhood park, she saw her sedan parked under the weeping willow. The dark green branches hung down over the roof, protecting the gray metal from the morning dew. The car looked small, quiet, and entirely hers. She reached into her pocket, pulled out her spare key, and unlocked the driver's side door. The interior of the car was freezing, the air smelling of old vinyl and the cardboard of her graduation box in the trunk. Clara climbed into the seat, closed the door with a solid, muffled thud, and inserted her spare key into the ignition. She turned the key. The engine coughed once, then started with its familiar, raspy growl, the dashboard lights flickering to life in a warm amber glow. She looked at the digital clock on the dashboard. 6:02 a.m. She did a quick calculation. The drive to the university campus would take exactly 42 minutes. She would arrive at the student parking garage by 6:44 a.m. The student union would open its doors at 7 a.m., and she would have nearly 2 hours to sit in a quiet corner with a cheap paper cup of gas station coffee, watching the campus wake up, completely free of their voices, their demands, and their schedules. She shifted the car into drive. She pulled out from under the willow tree, her tires rolling quietly over the wet asphalt. She didn't look back at the neighborhood in her rearview mirror. She looked straight ahead, watching the white headlights of her car cut through the thick gray morning fog as she steered toward the highway. The house behind her was still dark. Her parents were still sleeping. Maya was still dreaming of her medals. But Clara was already gone, her sedan accelerating smoothly onto the empty interstate, the low fuel light forgotten, the road ahead wide, quiet, and entirely clear. The plastic lid of the paper coffee cup gave a small wet pop as Clara pried it open. The steam rose in a thin, fragrant column, carrying the warm, bitter scent of cheap hazelnut roast. She sat at a small round table in the corner of the student union lobby. Around her, the vast, brick-walled atrium was slowly filling with a sea of black polyester. Hundreds of graduates paced the terrazzo floor, their gowns swishing softly, their voices combining into a bright, echoing hum of excitement. Parents carried bouquets of bright yellow sunflowers. Fathers struggled with heavy camera straps. Younger siblings sat on the steps, scrolling through their phones. Clara's phone lay flat on the laminate tabletop. At 7:15 a.m., the first vibration shook the wood, a short, sharp buzz. Eleanor. Clara, where are you? Maya needs the sedan keys right now. They aren't on the hook. Please bring them down. Clara took a slow, quiet sip of her coffee. The warmth spread through her chest, clean and steady. She didn't reply. At 7:32 a.m., the phone buzzed twice in rapid succession. Eleanor. Richard says you aren't in your room. Your bed is made, but you're not here. Clara, we are supposed to leave in 15 minutes. This is not funny. Where did you park the car? Maya is going to be late. Eleanor. Clara, answer your phone. Clara adjusted her mortarboard cap, which sat on the table beside her mug. She picked up her black gown from the adjacent chair. She slid her arms into the wide, bell-shaped sleeves, her fingers brushing against the stiff synthetic fabric. She pulled the zipper up to her collar, the metallic slide clicking as it locked into place. She reached down, her hand brushing the hem of the gown. The orange clay smudge from Maya's track socks was still there, a dry, faint mark against the dark polyester. She didn't try to hide it. She smoothed the fabric over her lap and sat back down. At 7:48 a.m., the phone began to vibrate continuously. It was a call from her father. Clara didn't press decline. She simply watched the screen illuminate, her father's name, Richard, flashing against the dark background. She watched the phone slide a millimeter across the slick laminate table with each vibration, buzzing like a trapped hornet until the screen went dark and the call transferred to voicemail. 5 seconds later, a text message arrived. Richard, Clara, your mother says the sedan is not in the driveway and your keys are still on the kitchen island. If you took that vehicle without permission, you are in serious violation of our agreement. Bring it back immediately. Your sister's entire season is on the line today. The language was still transactional, still carrying the heavy, commanding weight of an employer addressing a negligent staff member. They still believed this was a stunt. They still believed they held the keys to her life. At 8:05 a.m., the phone buzzed again. This time, the vibration was followed by a long, heavy silence. Eleanor. Clara. I went into your room to look for your spare keys in your desk. There was a 3-minute pause before the next message arrived. The text previews stacked up on her screen, a digital record of the exact second the illusion collapsed. Eleanor. Your closet is empty. All your hangers are bare. Where are your clothes, Clara? Where is your duffel bag? What is going on? At 8:12 a.m., another call came in, this one from her mother. The screen flashed, the light bright in the crowded lobby of the student union. A group of graduates next to her laughed loudly, posing for a photo with a large silver balloon shaped like the number 6. Clara looked at the balloon, then down at her phone. She did a quick calculation. Her family was currently 40 miles north, likely standing in the driveway or the empty hallway of her bedroom. The realization would be hitting them in slow, disjointed waves. Eleanor would be staring at the empty dresser drawers. Richard would be looking at the empty closet, realizing the canvas bags were gone. Maya would be throwing a fit in the driveway, realizing she had no ride, her track meet derailed, not by an accident, but by the sudden, absolute vacuum left by the person who had spent years absorbing their chaos. They were forced to deal with their own lives, and they had no idea how to do it without her. She picked up her phone. She didn't open the messages. She didn't listen to the voicemails. She held the power button down on the side of the device. The screen flickered, the white university logo appearing for a brief second, and then the display went completely black. She slid the quiet phone into the deep, hidden pocket of her graduation gown. Graduates, please begin making your way to the assembly tunnels. A loud, amplified voice echoed through the student union speakers. Lineup is by department. Please have your name cards ready. Clara stood up. She picked up her mortarboard cap, placing it carefully on her head, and adjusted the gold 2026 tassel until it hung precisely over her right temple. She walked toward the double glass doors that led to the stadium, her sneakers silent on the terrazzo floor, her gown swishing softly around her ankles. The air outside was cool and crisp, the morning fog finally burning off to reveal a brilliant, pale blue sky. As she walked into the tunnel, joining the long, slow-moving line of black gowns, she felt no anger. She felt no desire for confrontation. She only felt the quiet, immense weight of her own presence, a clean, empty space where her obligations used to be. She was the middle child who had forgotten to ask for permission to leave, and she was finally walking into her own light. The announcer's voice through the stadium's massive speaker system was crisp, carrying a slight, metallic echo that bounced off the concrete tiers of the arena. Clara Vance, Bachelor of Science in Psychology, magna cum laude. Clara stepped forward. Her sneakers made a soft, rubbery squeak on the heavy blue carpet lining the stage. She walked with a steady, unhurried gait, her posture straight, her chin slightly lifted. The dean of the department, a silver-haired man with kind, tired eyes, smiled warmly as he handed her the dark blue leather folder. "Congratulations, Clara," he said, his voice quiet beneath the roar of the crowd. "A brilliant academic record. We expect great things from you." "Thank you, Dr. Vance," Clara said. She turned toward the official university photographer. The strobe light flashed, a single, brilliant burst of white that printed the image of her success onto a digital file she would soon control. As she walked down the wooden steps on the far side of the stage, she looked out at the massive crowd filling the stadium seats. Thousands of faces blurred together under the bright morning sun. Mothers holding tissue papers to their eyes, fathers waving, siblings pointing. Among those thousands of occupied chairs, she looked at the specific section reserved for her department's guests. There were empty seats, scattered like missing teeth in a crowded smile. She stared at those empty spaces, but her chest did not tighten. There was no dull ache, no lingering wish that things had been different. The empty chairs did not represent her abandonment. They represented her liberation. They were the physical proof that she had finally stopped waiting for people who were never going to show up. She walked out of the stadium, her diploma folder tucked safely under her arm. By noon, the campus was a chaotic celebration of families taking photos, but Clara walked straight to her sedan. She unlocked the door, set her diploma folder on the passenger seat next to her backpack, and pulled her gown off, folding it neatly before placing it in the trunk. The orange clay stain on the hem was dry now, a faint, dirty reminder of the house she had left behind. She got into the car and turned the key. The engine hummed, and she drove away from the university, leaving the suburban county behind as she headed toward the highway that led to the city center. At 5:30 p.m., 40 miles north, the atmosphere in the Vance family SUV was suffocatingly tense. Maya's track meet had been a disaster. Frantic, late, and flustered by the chaotic morning of hunting for keys and realization, Eleanor had arrived at the stadium with Maya only 20 minutes before the starting gun. Maya, missing her lucky socks and rattled by her mother's hysterical driving, had clipped the third hurdle, finishing 6th in her heat, completely out of contention for the State Scouts roster. Richard had driven them back in absolute silence, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. Eleanor sat in the passenger seat, staring blankly out the window, her phone resting dead in her lap. They pulled into the driveway of the suburban house. The garage door rolled open, revealing the empty bay where Clara's sedan usually sat. They walked into the kitchen. The keys to the sedan were still sitting on the marble island, catching the cold gray light of the late afternoon. Eleanor ran up the stairs, her breath short and shallow. She pushed open the door to Clara's room. The space was hollow. The mattress sat bare, the single blue fleece blanket folded into a neat, dense square in the exact center of the fabric. The dresser drawers were pushed closed, completely empty. The closet door stood open, revealing a row of bare wooden hangers dangling from the metal rod, swinging slightly in the draft from the open window. On the desk, sitting in the center of the clean wood, was a single white envelope. Eleanor approached the desk, her hand trembling as she picked it up. She tore the paper open. Inside were the 2 bright blue, gold-embossed guest tickets to the university commencement ceremony. They were completely pristine, unused. Beside them lay a single sheet of paper, written in Clara's neat architectural print. "The keys are on the island. My student loans are settled. Do not contact me. I am no longer available." There was no forwarding address. There was no new phone number. Eleanor let the paper slip from her fingers, her face pale as she looked around the empty room. For years, they had viewed Clara's presence as a natural resource, a silent, replenishing supply of labor and convenience that they only noticed when the tap ran dry. Now, the tap was not just dry. The pipes had been entirely removed, leaving only the cold, quiet weight of her absence. A 40-minute drive away, in a small third-floor walk-up apartment overlooking a narrow brick alley, the sun was setting. Clara sat at a small wooden table she had found at a thrift store. On the table sat a single white ceramic mug of black coffee and a small plate of toast. The apartment was entirely quiet, free of the frantic schedules, the demanding voices, and the heavy, weaponized expectations that had defined her life for 22 years. She picked up her mug, the ceramic warm against her palms. She took a slow, quiet sip, looking out the window as the first streetlights of her new neighborhood flickered to life in the cool evening air. Sometimes, the quietest departures leave the loudest echoes. She had completely erased herself from their timeline, leaving behind a family that would spend years trying to learn how to walk without the silent anchor that had held them up. She was finally home. If you found yourself rooting for the quiet strength of the forgotten, and if you believe that sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones where karma acts in absolute, devastating silence, make sure to subscribe to Crazy Karma Stories. Here, we celebrate the resilient, the patient, and the ones who understand that the sweet sting of fate is best served in silence. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss another chapter of quiet justice, deep psychological reckonings, and the ultimate triumphs of those who were pushed too far. Thank you for listening to this journey. Stay strong, keep your boundaries high, and join us next time on Crazy Karma Stories.